Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Owen Fletcher had spent 11 years with the National Park Service learning to read landscapes the way other people read newspapers. Every broken branch told a story. Every displaced stone suggested a narrative. On October 17, 2011, standing at the Hoh River trailhead in Olympic National Park at 06:47 hours, he understood that Christopher Vail's disappearance would require him to read something far more difficult than terrain. The morning pressed against the temperate rainforest with that peculiar Olympic Peninsula dampness that never quite became rain, but saturated everything regardless. Fletcher adjusted his Motorola radio on his belt and studied the incident report on his iPhone 4, the small screen already collecting moisture despite the supposedly waterproof case. Vail, 34, experienced hiker, solo trek along the Hoh River Trail toward 5 Mile Island, 72 hours overdue. Tent located at mile marker 3.8, contents undisturbed, no signs of struggle. The detail that made Fletcher's analytical mind pause. Vail's journal, left open on his sleeping bag, the final entry referencing the one who feeds after death. Fletcher had seen his share of cryptic final words from people who'd met bad ends in the wilderness. Hypothermia produced elaborate delusions. Dehydration created conversations with absent family members. But Vail's words suggested something else, something researched rather than imagined. The phrase had that particular quality of translation, as if Vail had been rendering something from another language into English. District Ranger Sarah Chen briefed him at the trailhead, her rain jacket beaded with moisture that caught the weak morning light filtering through the Sitka spruce canopy. "SAR pulled out yesterday evening," she said, her voice carrying that exhaustion peculiar to failed rescue operations. "Scent dogs couldn't pick up a trail past the tent. It's like he just evaporated." "Weather conditions?" Fletcher asked, already pulling up historical data on his phone. "Clear. Unseasonably warm for October. No precipitation. Excellent visibility. He should have been an easy find." Chen shifted her weight, and Fletcher noted the unconscious gesture, the way her hand moved toward her radio as if checking its presence. Something had unsettled her beyond the standard frustration of an unsuccessful search. "What aren't you telling me?" Fletcher had learned that the most valuable information often lived in the spaces between official statements. Chen hesitated, then withdrew a plastic evidence bag from her pack. Inside, a photograph, edges curled with moisture. This was pinned to a tree 50 yards from Vail's tent. The pushpin was rusted through, looked like it had been there for years, but the photo... Fletcher took the bag. The photograph showed a man in clothing that suggested early 20th century, standing beside what appeared to be a hand-dug grave. The man's face had been scratched away with something sharp, perhaps a knife, but the methodical, repetitive nature of the scratches suggested obsessive attention rather than casual vandalism. Written across the bottom in faded pencil, Wilhelm Krause, 1923, Hoh Settlement. "There was a German immigrant community here," Chen said. "Loggers, mostly. They abandoned the settlement in the late 20s. Nothing left but some foundation stones and a small cemetery about half a mile off the main trail." Fletcher's mind began constructing connections. German immigrants, a reference to feeding after death, a scratched-out face in a photograph from a grave. "I need to see Vail's journal. It's at the tent site. We left everything in situ once we realized this might be more than a standard missing person case." Chen pulled out a topographic map, the paper soft with moisture. "The tent's here, elevation 642 feet, approximately 3.8 miles from the trailhead. The old cemetery is here northwest, about 2,200 feet off the trail through old growth. And there's something else." She indicated a location with her finger. "SAR reported radio interference in this area, compass needles spinning. Could be magnetic deposits in the rock, but the geology doesn't support that." Fletcher felt that familiar tension in his shoulders that signaled the beginning of a complex investigation. He'd joined NPS after finishing his master's in forensic anthropology, specifically because he appreciated mysteries that required assembly of disparate evidence into coherent narratives. But standing at the edge of the Hoh rainforest, with its cathedral ceiling of moss-draped branches filtering light into perpetual green twilight, he felt the first stirring of something that his analytical framework couldn't quite accommodate. The hike to Vale's tent took Fletcher 93 minutes, his Garmin GPS marking each tenth of a mile with steady precision. The Hoh River Trail followed the river's northern bank, the water running dark with tannins from decomposing vegetation, moving with that deceptive smoothness that concealed powerful currents. Massive Sitka spruces rose 200 feet overhead, their trunks vanishing into the canopy. Roosevelt elk had worn parallel trails through the sword ferns, and Fletcher noted fresh scat, perhaps 12 hours old. Everything appeared normal. Everything felt wrong. He'd hiked this trail dozens of times over the years, but today the quality of light seemed different, as if the photons themselves carried some additional weight. The usual birdsong had diminished to occasional distant crow calls. The air smelled of decay and growth in equal measure, that characteristic rainforest perfume of things dying to feed things living. But today, something acrid underlaid it, like old paper burning. Vale's tent materialized from the undergrowth at exactly 3 miles. A modern 2-person backpacking model in forest green. Fletcher photographed it from multiple angles before approaching, documenting the surrounding area with the methodical attention that had made him valuable for complex investigations. No scuff marks in the duff, no broken vegetation, no indication anyone had fled or been dragged away. Inside the tent, everything suggested interrupted normalcy. Sleeping bag unrolled, but not entered. Headlamp hanging from the ceiling loop. Water bottle 3/4 full. Camp stove with a pot containing what appeared to be freeze-dried stroganoff, half prepared. And on top of the sleeping bag, the journal, open to the final entry. Fletcher pulled on latex gloves and carefully lifted the journal. A standard moleskin notebook, its pages swollen with humidity. Vale's handwriting deteriorated across the entries, starting neat and controlled, becoming increasingly erratic. Fletcher photographed each page before reading. The early entries were unremarkable. Weather observations, wildlife sightings, mileage logs. But starting 4 days before Vale's disappearance, something shifted. October 13th, found interesting historical site off trail. Old cemetery, German names on wooden markers, most rotted beyond reading. One grave freshly disturbed. Not animals. The earth was moved in a pattern, concentric circles radiating outward from the center. No shovel marks, like something pushed up from below. Fletcher felt his pulse accelerate slightly, that physiological response to pattern recognition. October 14th, couldn't sleep, kept hearing sounds from direction of cemetery. Not animals, rhythmic, like chewing. Probably just elk browsing, but the persistence of it. At 0312 hours, I actually got up and stood at the tent entrance, listening. The sound stopped the moment I moved. Started again once I laid back down. Some acoustic trick of the terrain, obviously. Fletcher noted the word, obviously, that defensive addition people made when trying to convince themselves. October 15th. Researched the old settlement on my phone, barely any signal. German logging community, 1918-1928, abandoned following a disease outbreak. Couldn't find details on what disease. The cemetery has at least 40 graves. I counted them today. One of the markers is still partially readable. Wilhelm Krause, geboren 1867, gestorben 1923, Gott helfe seiner Seele. God help his soul. That's the grave that's disturbed. Checked local records on ancestry sites. Krause died of consumption but was actually suspected of suicide. Community petition to deny him burial in consecrated ground. The petition was denied by the local pastor, but Krause was buried at the cemetery's edge, facing away from the other graves. There's a reason for that in German folklore. Something about preventing the dead from... I need to find better information. Fletcher's analytical mind cataloged the details. Suicide, improper burial, German folklore. The phrase from the final entry, "the one who feeds after death." The last entry, dated October 16th, was barely legible. Found what they were afraid of. Nachtterror. Germanic vampire, but not like Dracula. It doesn't rise from the grave. It devours itself in the grave and feeds on the living from a distance. Psychic parasitism, drawing out life force. The chewing sounds are it consuming its own burial shroud, its own flesh. The more it devours itself, the more it can devour others. Signs: livestock deaths, wasting illness in the community, nightmares of suffocation. Prevention: stone or coin in the mouth, decapitation, staking. But if those aren't done properly at burial, the Kraus grave. Wrong direction, isolated position, and I found something today. I dug down maybe 8 inches at the head of the grave. I know I shouldn't have, but I had to know. There's no stone, no coin, just disturbed earth and something that might be fabric, shredded, moving slightly even though there's no wind down there. I've made a terrible mistake. I can feel it in my chest, this hollow sensation like something's pulling at my lungs from the inside. The sound tonight won't be elk. I need to leave at first light, if I'm not out tomorrow. If someone finds this, the Kraus grave needs to be opened and the head needs to be taken. Full decapitation. It's the only way to stop a Nachtterror. The old German settlers knew. They tried to stop it but failed. It's been feeding for 88 years. The entry ended there, the final sentence trailing off the page. Fletcher sat back on his heels, his mind working through the information with trained skepticism. Vale had clearly experienced some form of psychological break, possibly early-onset paranoid schizophrenia triggered by isolation. The combination of historical research, physical exertion, and solo camping had created a perfect environment for delusional thinking. The logical explanation satisfied Fletcher's need for rational frameworks. The hollow sensation in his own chest, which had started while reading Vale's final entry, was obviously psychosomatic, a product of suggestion and the oppressive atmosphere of the rainforest. Obviously. Fletcher spent 40 minutes documenting everything in the tent, then made the decision to locate the cemetery before nightfall. He had approximately 4 hours of usable daylight. Chen's map showed the cemetery's approximate location, and he had Vale's GPS coordinates from the journal. The distance was manageable. What struck Fletcher as he pushed through the undergrowth toward the cemetery was the progressive silence. The Hoh rainforest should have been alive with sound. Douglas squirrels chittering, varied thrushes calling, the constant drip of moisture from the canopy. Instead, the quiet deepened with each step, until Fletcher could hear his own breathing, the flex of his pack straps, the whisper of nylon against nylon. His Garmin GPS began showing erratic readings at 1-2 miles from the trail. The coordinates jumped randomly, suggesting interference from magnetic fields, though his compass showed no variation. Fletcher switched to dead reckoning, using the terrain features and his understanding of topography to navigate. The cemetery emerged from the forest without warning. A clearing perhaps 70 feet across, contained by a perimeter of ancient Sitka spruces, whose trunks bore deep carved symbols that Fletcher's rational mind wanted to dismiss as natural scarring, but which clearly showed deliberate pattern: crosses, circles, what might have been stylized eyes. 43 wooden markers, most collapsed or rotted to fragments. No maintenance for 8 decades. Nature reclaiming what humans had briefly borrowed. And at the clearing's edge, facing northwest while all other graves faced east, the Kraus burial site. Fletcher approached slowly, documenting with his camera. The marker, more intact than others, showed hand-carved German script, the letters deep and deliberate. Below the epitaph, someone had carved additional symbols, a circle bisected by a line, repeated 3 times. Fletcher recognized it from his anthropology studies, an apotropaic mark designed to ward off evil. The grave itself showed clear signs of disturbance, not the random disruption of animal activity, but something systematic. Earth had been moved in concentric patterns, as Vale described, radiating outward from the center, and at the grave's head, a depression, perhaps 8 inches deep, exactly where Vale claimed to have dug. Fletcher knelt beside the depression, his mind insisting on rational explanation even as something deeper and more primitive in his nervous system signaled alarm. He could see the disturbed fabric Vale mentioned, tatters of what might have been burial shroud, partially exposed. The fabric moved slightly, a flutter that Fletcher's conscious mind attributed to air currents, though his unconscious mind recognized no breeze touched the forest floor. The hollow sensation in his chest intensified, a feeling of internal vacuum, as if his lungs were expanding but drawing in nothing. Fletcher stood abruptly, his vision momentarily graying at the edges. Low blood sugar, dehydration, altitude adjustment, though 850 feet hardly qualified as significant elevation. His iPhone showed 1647 hours, less than 2 hours until full darkness. Fletcher needed to make a decision: return to the tent site or push through to the trailhead. The rational choice was to camp at Vale's location, maintain the investigation site, continue search efforts at first light. But standing in that clearing, with the inadequate daylight filtering through the canopy and the absolute silence pressing against his eardrums, Fletcher felt a compulsion to move, to put distance between himself and the Kraus grave. He began walking back toward the trail. The hollow sensation in his chest didn't diminish. If anything, it intensified, spreading to his abdomen, as if something was methodically excavating his internal organs. Fletcher stopped twice to check his vital signs, his fingers on his carotid finding a pulse that seemed too fast, too thready. Stress response, anxiety. Nothing more. The forest had grown darker, that rapid transition from twilight to night that happened under heavy canopy. Fletcher switched on his headlamp, the LED beam cutting a tunnel through the darkness but somehow making everything beyond the light seem even more impenetrable. His Garmin GPS continued showing erratic readings, coordinates jumping across the map in impossible patterns. When Fletcher heard the sound, his first instinct was to identify its source through analysis. Rhythmic, wet, methodical, like something chewing on cartilage or fabric or both. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, or perhaps from inside his own head, transmitted through bone conduction rather than air. He stopped walking. The sound continued, not in sync with his footsteps then, not some mechanical noise from his pack or clothing. Fletcher's training insisted on rational assessment, audio pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random noise. The forest was full of sounds that could be misinterpreted: decomposing wood settling, water dripping onto leaves, small mammals browsing. His stressed mental state, combined with Vale's journal entries, had primed him to interpret ambiguous sounds as something sinister. But the sound had that quality of deliberation, of conscious action, that no random natural process could replicate. Fletcher resumed walking, faster now, his analytical framework beginning to show stress fractures. The hollow sensation had spread to his extremities, a feeling of progressive emptiness, as if something was slowly erasing him from the inside out. His fingers felt numb, his legs moved with increasing difficulty, not from fatigue, but from that internal vacuum, as if the muscles had been partially evacuated. When he reached Vale's tent at 1834 hours, full darkness had settled over the forest. Fletcher's hands shook as he set up his own shelter 15 feet from Vale's tent, his movements clumsy, his breathing rapid and shallow. The hollow sensation made each breath feel insufficient, as if his lungs were drawing vacuum rather than air. He forced himself through his evening routine with military precision. Filter water from the river, prepare meal, hang food bag, check radio, static only, no response from Chen or the ranger station. Check phone, no signal, battery at 47% despite full charge that morning. Check GPS, coordinates showing his location as approximately 800 miles northeast, somewhere in central Montana. All his technological tethers had failed simultaneously. Fletcher sat in his tent with his headlamp extinguished, listening to the forest. The silence felt aggressive now, as if something was actively suppressing sound, rather than sound simply being absent. And beneath the silence, or perhaps within it, that rhythmic, wet chewing, patient and methodical. His training in forensic anthropology had required studying taphonomy, the science of decay. Fletcher had spent months learning how bodies decompose, what they sound like in various stages of breakdown. The sound he was hearing resembled nothing in his catalog of decay processes. This was deliberate consumption, flesh on flesh, the sound of something devouring itself with systematic attention. The hollow sensation intensified until Fletcher gasped, his hands moving to his chest as if he could physically prevent whatever was happening. His heart felt like it was beating against nothing, pumping into void. He fumbled for his first aid kit, found his pulse oximeter, clipped it to his finger. The device showed oxygen saturation at 76%, pulse 134. Both numbers should have had him unconscious or seizing. Fletcher's analytical mind provided one final rational framework before collapsing entirely. Hypoxia-induced hallucination, possibly caused by carbon monoxide poisoning from a defective camp stove, creating both physical symptoms and sensory distortions. But he hadn't used his stove. The chewing sound grew louder, or closer, or both. Fletcher turned on his headlamp with trembling fingers, the beam cutting through his tent fabric to illuminate the clearing beyond. Nothing, just the dark shapes of trees and Vale's abandoned tent. He swept the beam in a slow arc. The movement at the edge of his light made his breath catch. Not an animal. Something at the wrong height, approximately 5 feet off the ground, suspended between trees. As Fletcher's light touched it, the movement ceased, becoming absolute stillness. He couldn't process what he was seeing. The shape suggested humanity, but violated every principle of human anatomy. Elongated, desiccated, partially consumed as if something had been systematically devouring it from within. The skin collapsed where flesh should have been. The face turned toward Fletcher's light, and in that moment he understood what he was seeing, even as his mind screamed rejection. Christopher Vale hung in the air between the trees, his body positioned as if suspended on invisible wires, his mouth working in slow mastication, his hands brought to his face in repetitive motion, fingers to lips to mouth, feeding on his own substance. His eyes had a glazed quality, consciousness present but imprisoned, awareness trapped in a body that no longer fully belonged to him. Vale's mouth moved and a sound emerged, not quite speech, more like vocalization filtered through damaged vocal cords. Can't. Stop. Feeding. Fletcher's professional training, his 11 years of systematic investigation, his entire rational framework, all of it shattered in that moment. He recognized the impossible truth that Vale's journal had documented. The Nachtseher didn't rise from its grave. It didn't need to. It fed from a distance, parasitically connecting to the living, and those it infected became extensions of itself, caught in the compulsion to devour, to consume, to feed on their own substance, until nothing remained but the hollow ache of perpetual hunger. The hollow sensation in Fletcher's chest suddenly made terrible sense. He looked down at his hands, seeing the beginning tremor, the way his fingers wanted to move toward his face, the involuntary urge to bring something, anything, to his mouth. The infection, if that word even applied, was already working in him. He'd stayed too long near the grave, breathed the same air that emanated from the disturbed earth, established the connection that the Nachtseher needed. Vale's body dropped from its suspension, hitting the ground with the dense thud of meat. Fletcher watched, paralyzed by horror and incomprehension as Vale began crawling toward him, his movements wrong, puppet-like, his jaw still working in that constant mastication. Behind Vale, the darkness between trees seemed to deepen and coalesce, suggesting shape without quite forming it, a presence that Fletcher's eyes couldn't quite focus on, but his nervous system recognized with absolute certainty. The thing in the Kraus grave wasn't dead. Hadn't been dead for 88 years. It existed in some state between death and life, sustained by its own consumption and the life force it drained from those who came too close. The German settlers had known. They'd tried to stop it with isolation and apotropaic marks. They'd failed. The thing had fed on them slowly, across years, draining the community until abandonment became the only survival strategy. Fletcher forced his body into motion, his hands grabbing his pack, his legs propelling him out of the tent and away from Vale's crawling form. The hollow sensation made his movements difficult, as if he was operating a body that was partially evacuated, but fear provided enough adrenaline to overcome the internal vacuum. He ran. The forest at night under heavy canopy approached absolute darkness, but Fletcher didn't dare use his headlamp, some instinct warning him that light would make him more visible to whatever was hunting him. He navigated by feel and memory, his hands outstretched, his feet finding the trail through a combination of luck and desperation. Behind him, sounds multiplied. Not just the chewing anymore, but movement, multiple sources, as if the forest itself had become ambulatory. Fletcher's rational mind tried to categorize what he was hearing but found no framework. These weren't animal sounds. They weren't human sounds. They were something else. Something that existed in the space his education had never acknowledged. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Fletcher pulled it out, seeing Chen's number on the screen despite the previous lack of signal. He answered without stopping his headlong flight through darkness. "Fletcher?" Chen's voice sounded distant, distorted, as if transmitted through water. "Fletcher, where are you? We're getting strange readings, multiple heat signatures in your area, but they're wrong, they're..." "Chen," Fletcher gasped, his lungs burning with that hollow ache. "You need to seal the cemetery. Fire. You need to burn the Kraus grave. Full cremation. It's the only way to..." The line went dead, not with a clean disconnect, but with a sound like wet fabric tearing. Fletcher's foot caught on a root, sending him sprawling. He landed hard, his chin striking a rock, pain exploding through his jaw. For a moment he lay still, tasting blood, feeling the forest close around him like a fist. The chewing sound was everywhere now, omnidirectional, as if the entire forest was consuming itself. He pushed himself up, his hands sinking into duff that felt wrong, too wet, too warm, organic in a way that suggested active decay rather than passive decomposition. Something brushed his face and Fletcher recoiled, his headlamp finally activating in his panic. The light revealed Vale standing 5 feet away, but Vale transformed. His body had collapsed further, the consumption more advanced. Great hollows where his abdomen and thighs should have been. His hands worked constantly, bringing pieces of himself to his mouth, feeding the compulsion that had overtaken his nervous system. His eyes met Fletcher's, and in them Fletcher saw awareness, imprisonment, the consciousness trapped inside a body enslaved to appetite. "Join us," Vale said, but the voice belonged to something older, something speaking through Vale's vocal cords with an accent that suggested German origins. "Das Fleisch ruft, the flesh calls. We are hungry. We have been hungry so long. Feed. Feed with us. Feed on yourself until there is nothing left but need." Fletcher's hands moved toward his face without conscious direction, his fingers seeking his lips, the compulsion spreading through his nervous system like electricity. He could feel the Noxera's will, not as external force but as internal urgency, his own body betraying him at cellular level. The hollow ache intensified until Fletcher couldn't distinguish between the sensation of being drained and the urge to drain himself. He bit down on his tongue, hard enough to flood his mouth with blood, the pain shocking his system back into momentary control. While clarity lasted, Fletcher made his decision. He couldn't outrun this, couldn't outthink it. The infection was already too advanced, working through his body with parasitic efficiency, but he could maybe stop it from spreading to others. Fletcher pulled his Motorola radio, praying for just enough signal to warn them. His thumb found the emergency channel. "All stations, this is Fletcher, Olympic District. Quarantine Ho River Trail immediately. No entry past mile marker 3. The cemetery at Kraus location is active biological hazard. Repeat, active hazard. Recommend complete burn, minimum 2000 degree Fahrenheit. Do not approach Kraus grave. Do not..." Vale lunged, his hands closing around the radio, crushing it. But not before Fletcher saw a flicker of acknowledgement. The message had transmitted, at least partially. Fletcher swung his pack, the weight catching Vale in the chest and knocking him backward. Then Fletcher ran again, no longer toward the trailhead but perpendicular to it. away from the direction anyone else might approach. If the infection was spreading, if others like Vale were being created, Fletcher needed to lead them away from populated areas. The hollow sensation had spread until Fletcher felt like a walking vacuum, his body a shell around emptiness. His hands kept trying to move to his face. His jaw worked constantly, wanting to chew, to consume, to feed. He stumbled through the darkness, bouncing off trees, splashing through unnamed creeks, his sense of direction completely lost. When Fletcher finally collapsed, his body simply refusing further motion, dawn was touching the eastern sky with that weak gray light that preceded sunrise. He lay on damp earth, staring up through the canopy, feeling the infection work through him with methodical precision. His hands were at his mouth before he could stop them, his teeth finding purchase on his thumb, the pain distant and unimportant compared to the urgency of consumption. Fletcher bit down harder on his tongue, using pain to maintain a fragment of consciousness. He understood now what Vale had experienced, that terrible awareness trapped inside a body controlled by parasitic will. The Nachtzerer fed by establishing psychic connection. Yes, but the true horror wasn't the draining. It was the way it made you complicit in your own consumption, turned your body against itself, made you the instrument of your own destruction. Footsteps approached, multiple sets, moving with coordinated purpose. Fletcher turned his head, seeing figures emerge from the undergrowth. Not Vale, others, 3 of them, their bodies showing varying stages of consumption, their movements puppet-like, their eyes aware and imprisoned. German settlers, Fletcher realized, his analytical mind still functioning despite everything. The original victims, sustained for decades in this state, caught between life and death, consciousness preserved in bodies that served the thing in the Kraus grave. The eldest of them, a woman whose dress suggested 1920s origin, knelt beside Fletcher. Her face had collapsed on one side, flesh consumed, but her remaining eye held terrible clarity. When she spoke, her voice carried that same German accent, filtered through damaged vocal cords. "We tried to warn," she said. "Carved symbols, isolated the grave, but Wilhelm was strong even in death. Stronger because of how he died. The suicide, the rage, the hunger that drove him to the grave, it all feeds the Nachtzerer, makes it powerful. We thought if we left it would starve. But it doesn't need many. Just one every few years. Hikers, campers, people drawn to the cemetery by curiosity. It takes them slowly, makes them feed on themselves while it feeds on them. Eventually they become like us. Empty vessels, consciousness trapped inside bodies that serve hunger." Fletcher's hands continued their movement toward his face, his control slipping. "How," he managed through damaged tongue, "how do you still think?" "The Nachtzerer needs awareness," the woman said. "Needs its victims conscious, able to understand what's happening. The horror is part of the feeding. Your terror, your resistance, your final acceptance, it all nourishes the thing in the grave." Another figure emerged from the forest, and Fletcher's heart lurched. Christopher Vale, his consumption more advanced than even hours before, his body partially collapsed, great cavities where flesh should have been. But walking, still moving, still aware. "I tried to warn you," Vale said, his voice barely recognizable. "Tried to write enough that you'd understand to stay away. But the Nachtzerer made me write just enough to draw you closer. It knew you'd investigate. Knew your curiosity would bring you to the grave. It's patient. 88 years is nothing to it. It can wait. It has us. It doesn't need to rush." Fletcher felt his jaw working, his hands pulling something to his mouth. He couldn't tell what anymore, flesh or fabric or air. The compulsion overrode everything, reducing consciousness to single imperative: feed. Through the haze of infection, Fletcher heard helicopter rotors, distant but approaching. His emergency transmission had been received. They were coming, but coming to what? To him? To others infected? The Nachtzerer had been feeding for nearly 9 decades on occasional victims. What would happen if Fletcher led SAR teams to this location? How many would it take? How many more empty shells would join the congregation serving the thing in the Kraus grave? With his last fragment of voluntary control, Fletcher pulled his emergency flare from his pack. The woman reached for him, trying to stop him, but Fletcher's fingers found the ignition switch. The flare burst to life, brilliant crimson light that made the infected figures recoil. Fletcher pressed the flare to the duff, to the dry underside of a fallen log, to anything that would catch. The woman shrieked, a sound of such anguish that Fletcher almost stopped. Almost. But he understood what he was doing. Not destroying the Noxerer. Fire wouldn't reach deep enough to the grave, but marking his location, warning others away, making the area too visible, too investigated, too dangerous for the thing to continue its patient feeding. The flames spread with surprising speed, encouraged by decades of accumulated duff. Racing through the undergrowth, the infected figures retreated, their bodies driven by survival instinct even though consciousness might have welcomed the flames. Fletcher lay still as smoke began to fill his lungs, as heat started to crisp his skin. The hollow sensation was complete now, his body nothing but shell, his consciousness floating in the space where organs should have been. His jaw worked constantly, bringing his own fingers to his mouth, feeding the hunger that would never be satisfied. The helicopter sounds grew louder. Fletcher tried to call out to warn them, but his voice served only appetite now, his vocal cords producing sounds that mimicked the chewing from the Kraus grave. Through the smoke, Fletcher saw a figure moving toward him. Not infected. Still fully human. Wearing the uniform of NPS SAR. The figure reached for him, trying to pull him from the spreading flames. Fletcher's hands moved faster than thought, grabbing the rescuer, pulling them close, his jaw opening wide. The Noxerer's will overriding everything human that remained. The hollow ache demanded filling, and the rescuer's vitality called to that emptiness like a beacon. But at the final moment, something in Fletcher's fragmenting consciousness surged, some core identity that refused complete surrender. Instead of biting down on the rescuer's flesh, Fletcher threw himself backward into the flames, his body becoming an extension of the fire rather than an extension of the hunger. The pain was absolute, total, overwhelming every nerve ending. But beneath the pain, Fletcher felt something else, the severing of connection, the psychic thread that bound him to the Kraus grave finally burning away. The hollow sensation retreated, not filled but released, consciousness finding moment of clarity in the midst of destruction. Fletcher's last coherent thought, as flame consumed nerve endings and boiled fluids and reduced flesh to carbon, was gratitude. Not for death. Death would have been preferable to the parasitic existence of the others. Gratitude that his final act had been warning rather than transmission. Resistance rather than capitulation. The flames spread across 300 acres before aerial suppression contained them. The investigation revealed multiple human remains, some recent, others dating back decades, all showing similar patterns of consumption. The Kraus grave was excavated under strict protocol, revealing skeletal remains that showed massive dental wear, the jawbones scored with thousands of scratch marks from constant chewing. The skull was separated from the body and cremated at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. But the NPS SAR coordinator, who had tried to rescue Fletcher, noticed something in the months following the incident. A hollow sensation in his chest, a compulsion to bring his hands to his mouth, an urge to chew that became more insistent with each passing day. The Kraus grave had been destroyed, but the Noxerer, patient and hungry, had learned to establish connections more subtly, to spread through brief contact, to ensure its survival through distribution rather than concentration. It had been feeding for 88 years from a single location. Now it could feed everywhere. The coordinator tried to write a report, documenting his symptoms, warning others. But his hands wouldn't cooperate. They brought themselves to his mouth instead, his fingers seeking his lips, his jaw beginning that rhythmic motion that would continue, day after day, year after year, consciousness imprisoned in a body enslaved to hunger. And deep in the earth where the Kraus grave had been, in soil saturated with decades of psychic feeding, something stirred. Not Wilhelm Kraus himself. His physical remains had been destroyed. But the imprint he'd left, the psychic scar tissue, the space he'd carved in reality through 88 years of sustained hunger. Nature, as the old German settlers had understood, abhors a vacuum, and the Nachtzerer was, fundamentally, an expression of appetite's triumph over flesh, of hunger's victory over identity. The empty space where Wilhelm Krause had fed was already calling to new hunger, ready to be filled again, patient in the way that only truly ancient things can be patient. The coordinates of the old cemetery are still marked on official maps: 47.863 degree N, 123.9355 degree W, elevation 850 feet, Olympic National Park. The area remains closed to public access, officially due to fire damage and ongoing ecological restoration. But on quiet nights when the wind moves through the Hoh rainforest, rangers stationed at the visitor center sometimes report hearing a sound carried down from the high country, rhythmic, wet, methodical, like something chewing. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Thomas Garrett had learned to recognize the particular quality of silence that preceded discovery. 23 years with the National Park Service had taught him that the forest held its breath before revealing what it had been hiding, and on that October morning in 2009, the Hoh rainforest was holding its breath. He adjusted the Motorola radio clip to his belt and continued along the trail, his boots leaving shallow impressions in moss that had been growing since before his grandfather was born. The temperate rainforest wrapped around him like something alive, Sitka spruce rising 200 feet overhead, their trunks shaggy with curtains of moss that dripped steadily despite no rain having fallen for 3 days. Everything here grew on top of something dead. Nurse logs sprouted forests of their own, ferns erupting from rot, new life consuming old in an endless cycle that Thomas found himself thinking about more than was probably healthy. The missing person report had come through dispatch at dawn. Rebecca Hollis, 26, solo hiker, last seen 4 days ago at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, where she'd signed the trail register for a 2-day trip up the Hoh River Trail. She'd planned to camp at 5 Mile Island, then return. She hadn't returned. Thomas had worked 18 missing person cases in his career. He'd found 14 of them alive, usually embarrassed and dehydrated, occasionally injured. 3 had been corpses by the time he'd located them. 1 he'd never found at all, and that one still visited him in the hours before dawn, a gap-toothed smile and a name he wouldn't let himself forget. The trail climbed gradually through a valley so thick with vegetation that visibility extended barely 30 feet in any direction. Sword ferns formed walls of green that brushed his shoulders as he walked. Everything dripped. The air itself felt saturated, like breathing through wet cloth. The coordinates for 5 Mile Island put it at 47.8701 Aguer N, 123.8812 W, elevation 678 feet, though the trail map had the campsite marked more specifically on a gravel bar beside the river, where the Hoh bent south. His Garmin GPS unit showed he was a quarter mile out. Thomas increased his pace, noting the degraded boot prints pressed into mud between exposed roots. The prints were filling with water, which meant they were at least a day old, possibly 2. Wrong size for Rebecca according to her gear manifest, probably another hiker, though the Hoh River Trail saw sparse traffic in October. He smelled the campsite before he saw it. Not smoke exactly, but something burnt, acrid and organic in a way that made him think of hair singed in a flame. Thomas unclipped his radio and thumbed the transmit button. Ranger Garrett to base. I'm approaching 5 Mile Island coordinates, detecting possible camp activity. Static crackled back. Copy, Garrett. Report conditions. Stand by. The campsite came into view as he rounded a massive spruce and Thomas stopped walking. His hand dropped from the radio. The tent was green, a Coleman 2-person dome that matched Rebecca's gear description. It stood properly erected in a cleared space 15 feet from the river's edge. Rainfly taut. Entrance zipped closed. A circle of river stones contained the remnants of a fire. and beside it sat a small cooking pot and a blue stuff sack that had spilled its contents onto the ground, freeze-dried food packets and a water filter scattered across moss. All of this was normal, expected even. What wasn't normal was the tent's condition. The nylon fabric was weathered, faded from what should have been vibrant green to a pale sage color. The material was degraded along the seams, the kind of deterioration that took months of exposure, not days. The rainfly was spotted with mildew. When Thomas crouched beside the fire ring, he found stones so cold they felt like they'd never held heat, and beneath the gray ash were fragments of burnt wood so old they crumbled to powder when he touched them. He stood up slowly, a sensation building in his chest that he'd learned not to ignore. The wrongness detector his old partner Maria had called it, that sense when something refused to align with reality. Thomas approached the tent and examined it without touching. The zippers were intact, the door panel tight against its frame. He leaned closer and caught a smell that made him step back involuntarily. A thick sweetness like flowers left too long in stale water. Rot, but floral. The kind of smell that made saliva flood his mouth as his body tried to decide whether to vomit. Rebecca Hollis? His voice fell flat in the dense air. This is Ranger Thomas Garrett with the National Park Service. I need to verify you're okay. Nothing moved inside the tent. The silence felt deliberate. Thomas circled the campsite, documenting everything mentally for his report. The blue stuff sack appeared new, the nylon crisp and bright. The water filter looked recently used, water still beaded on its surface, but the tent itself looked like it had been standing here through an entire winter, exposed to rain and sun and the relentless humidity of the rainforest. He found the first boot print 20 feet from the tent, pressed into soft earth between the roots of a western hemlock. The print was deep, the tread pattern clear, recent enough that water hadn't yet filled the depression. It pointed away from the campsite, toward a dense section of forest where no trail existed. Thomas followed the prints. There were 6 of them, each one precisely spaced, the stride length consistent. They led directly to the base of an enormous nurse log, a fallen spruce, so massive that its root system had torn a crater 6 feet deep when it toppled. The roots formed a wooden wall, earth clinging to their undersides, and at the base of this crater the boot prints ended, not faded out or obscured by vegetation. They simply stopped, as if Rebecca had walked to this spot and ceased to exist. Thomas crouched at the edge of the crater and examined the exposed earth. Something had disturbed it recently. Scratch marks scored the dirt, too deliberate to be from animals. They converged on a section where the soil looked looser, darker. He reached out to touch it and stopped himself, that wrongness detector screaming now. The scratches came from underneath. They radiated outward from the disturbed soil, as if something had been clawing its way up from below. Thomas stood up fast enough that his vision spotted. He keyed his radio with a hand that he was annoyed to find shaking. Garrett to base, I've located the campsite. Tent is present but unoccupied. I need a full SAR team up here and I need Detective Mitchell from the county if he's available. Copy. Is this a recovery situation? Thomas looked at the scratches in the earth, then back at the weathered tent with its new supplies scattered beside it. I don't know what kind of situation this is. The radio crackled and went silent. Thomas waited for acknowledgement but got only static. He checked the unit, saw a full battery, and tried again. Nothing. The Hoh River Valley was notoriously bad for radio reception, but he'd transmitted clearly just 2 minutes ago. He was still trying to raise base when he heard the sound. It came from beneath the earth where the boot prints ended, a wet, rhythmic noise like someone chewing with their mouth open, soft but distinct, and it paused when Thomas held his breath as if whatever made it was listening back. Thomas took 3 steps backward, his hand moving instinctively to his bear spray. The chewing resumed, steady and deliberate, and now he could hear something else underneath it, a whisper of fabric dragging over soil. He needed to get back to the visitor center, needed to bring people with equipment and daylight and rational explanations. Thomas turned from the crater and walked quickly toward the trail, not quite running but moving faster than professional composure typically allowed. He made it 20 feet before he saw the tent had changed. The entrance was unzipped now, gaping open like a mouth. He'd left it sealed. He was certain he'd left it sealed. Thomas stopped, and the chewing sound stopped with him, and in the silence that followed he heard his own breathing, too fast, too shallow. The tent's opening was dark inside, completely black despite the gray daylight. As Thomas stared, something pale moved in that darkness, there and gone so quickly he could almost convince himself he'd imagined it. He should investigate. Protocol demanded he clear the tent, confirm whether Rebecca was injured inside, whether this was a rescue situation. But Thomas's feet wouldn't move forward, and for the first time in 23 years he felt something he'd learned to bury after the case he didn't like to remember, the hiker he'd never found. He felt afraid of what he might discover. Thomas backed toward the trail, keeping the tent in his peripheral vision. The wrongness had weight now, a pressure against his chest that made each breath require conscious effort. He'd felt this before, 3 years ago, in a different forest, and it had ended with search dogs refusing to track, equipment failures, and eventually a case file marked as unresolved. He'd promised himself he wouldn't end up in a situation like that again. He'd been careful, methodical, professional. He'd transferred to Olympic specifically because it was safer, more predictable, nothing like the deep wilderness where the chewing sound erupted from multiple directions simultaneously, behind him, to his left, from the tent itself. Not loud, but layered, as if the earth around him had developed a mouth and was eating something soft and wet. Thomas ran. He hit the trail at full speed and didn't slow down for a quarter mile, his breath burning in his throat, the Motorola slapping against his hip. The sounds faded behind him but didn't disappear entirely. They lingered at the edge of his hearing, patient, in no hurry. When he finally stopped, gasping, he was far enough down the trail that the oppressive density of the rainforest had thinned slightly. He could see patches of gray sky through the canopy. His radio crackled suddenly with perfect clarity. "Garrett, this is base. Do you copy?" "You broke up completely. Repeat your last transmission." Thomas stared at the radio in his hand. His fingers had gone white-knuckled around it. "Base, I'm returning to the visitor center. I need that SAR team staged and ready. I need someone from the county who has experience with..." He trailed off. Experience with what? Campsites that aged wrong? Boot prints that led to scratched earth? Sounds that came from beneath the ground? Garrett? What kind of experience? Thomas looked back up the trail toward where the campsite waited, still impatient. Someone who won't think I'm losing my mind. He reached the visitor center 40 minutes later, his uniform soaked through with sweat despite the October chill. The building sat at the terminus of the unpaved access road, a modest structure of wood and glass that served as the gateway to the Ho Rain Forest. 3 cars occupied the parking lot, including his own truck and a silver Honda that belonged to Rachel Chen, the interpretive ranger who worked the front desk during off-season. Rachel looked up as Thomas pushed through the door, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to concern in the space of a heartbeat. "Jesus, Thomas. What happened? I need to use the phone." Thomas moved past her toward the office, already dialing the number for Clallam County Sheriff. "And I need you to pull every piece of documentation we have on 5 Mile Island. Historical records, incident reports, geological surveys if we have them. Anything." Rachel followed him into the office. "Thomas, you look like you've seen..." "Please, Rachel, just do it." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded and disappeared toward the filing cabinets. Thomas got Detective Frank Mitchell on the 3rd ring, explained what he'd found with as much clinical precision as he could manage, and carefully did not mention the sounds from beneath the earth, or his conviction that something pale had moved inside that tent. Mitchell agreed to drive out with the deputy. 2 hours, he said. Thomas hung up and realized his hands were shaking again. "I found something." Thomas turned to find Rachel standing in the doorway holding a manila folder gone soft with age. Her face had lost color. "I pulled the historical incident reports like you asked. Thomas, you need to see this." The folder contained photocopies of documents dating back to 1983. Rachel had marked several pages with sticky notes and Thomas flipped to the first one. It was a missing person report for a hiker named Sarah Keene, 24 years old, who had vanished from 5 Mile Island in September 1983. She'd been camping alone. Her tent was found intact and properly erected with supplies scattered nearby. No trace of Sarah was ever found. The second marked page was from 1991. Michael Torres, 31, disappeared from the same campsite. Tent intact, supplies present, no body recovered. 1997, Jennifer Walsh, 29, same circumstances. 2003, David fucking Morrison, 33, same campsite, same impossible situation. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Why didn't I know about this? They're coded as separate incidents, Rachel said quietly. Different years, different case numbers, filed under standard missing persons. Nobody would connect them unless they were specifically looking for a pattern. She paused. Thomas, there's one more thing. I found a reference to a historian who studied European settlement patterns in the Olympic Peninsula. He left notes about German immigrants who settled in the Ho River Valley in the 1890s. There was a small community here before the park was established, and they abandoned the settlement. All of them, in a single winter. There was a plague outbreak. Where's this historian now? He died in 2004, but his research is archived at University of Washington. He left notes about... Rachel hesitated, her eyes dropping to the folder. He mentioned burial practices, something about the German settlers being terrified of their own dead. He used a word I had to look up. Nachtzerer. Thomas felt the temperature in the office drop. The word hung in the air between them, sharp-edged and foreign. What does it mean? It's from German folklore, a type of revenant, something that rises from the grave. The historian's notes say the settlers believed that people who died from plague or who died with their names unspoken could become Nachtzerer. They'd consume themselves in the grave first, eating their own burial shroud, and then they'd rise to feed on their family members. The settlers took precautions, special burial rites, blessed ground, specific ways of laying out the dead. Rachel's voice had gone soft. Thomas, the historian's last research trip was to 5 Mile Island. He was trying to locate the original settlement's burial ground. He went out there alone in October. October, Thomas repeated. The same month every disappearance had occurred. The same week, actually. Mid-October every time, between the 15th and 20th. Thomas checked the date on his watch. October 17th. They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Rachel spoke again. What did you see out there, Thomas? He thought about the answer, about how to explain wrongness that defied articulation. Something that doesn't make sense, he said finally. A campsite that's been there for months but also just days. Boot prints that led to disturbed earth. Sounds like... He stopped himself. Like what? Like something chewing. Underground. Rachel's face went very still. The folklore says they eat themselves first. The shroud, their own flesh. That's how you know one has risen. You hear chewing in the cemetery, cloth tearing, the sound of consumption from beneath the earth. Thomas stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against linoleum. I need to go back out there before Mitchell arrives. Rebecca Hollis could still be alive. She could be injured, trapped somewhere. I can't just sit here while... While what? Rachel's voice was sharp now. Thomas, 4 people have vanished from that exact spot. Whatever's happening there, going back alone before help arrives is exactly what it wants you to do. What it wants. Rachel, we're talking about a missing woman, not folklore. But even as he said it, Thomas remembered the pale movement in the tent's darkness, the impossibility of the weathered fabric and fresh supplies, the way the chewing had surrounded him from beneath the earth itself. Rachel stood and moved to the window, looking out at the forest that pressed close to the visitor center. The historian's notes mention one other detail. The Nachtzerer can mimic the living. They appear as the person they were before death, calling out to family, leaving signs that lure people to the grave, and they're strongest in places where the boundary between worlds is thin, places where death has seeped into the ground. She turned back to Thomas. 4 people have died in that location over 26 years. How much death do you think has soaked into that earth? Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to dismiss it all as coincidence and superstition. But he'd spent 2 decades in the wilderness, and he knew that forests kept secrets, that some places held darkness that defied explanation. He'd learned that 3 years ago in a different forest, when he'd followed boot prints that led in circles and found a campsite that couldn't exist, and eventually stopped searching because the forest itself seemed to be hiding what he sought. He'd promised himself he wouldn't end up in that situation again. But here he was, and the forest was holding its breath. Mitchell will be here in 2 hours, Thomas said. When he arrives, we go back together, full team, proper equipment, daylight remaining. We do this by the book. Rachel nodded slowly. And if Rebecca calls for help before then? Then we respond, but not alone. Never alone. They waited. Thomas tried to write his initial report 3 times and deleted each attempt, unable to find words that captured what he'd experienced without sounding unhinged. Rachel made coffee that neither of them drank. The afternoon light filtering through the windows grew slanted and golden, the quality of illumination that preceded evening. At 3:47 p.m., Thomas's cell phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but it had a local area code. He answered. Ranger Garrett. Thomas? The voice was female, young, strained with pain and fear. Thomas, please, I'm hurt. I need help. I'm at the campsite. I can't move my leg. Something's wrong with it. Please come help me. Thomas's throat closed. Who is this? It's Rebecca Hollis. Please, you have to come quickly. It's getting dark and I can hear something moving around the tent. I'm scared, Thomas. Please hurry. The line went dead. Thomas stared at his phone. The call had lasted 14 seconds. He checked the recent calls list. The number was there, a standard 10-digit format. But when he tried to call it back, he got a recording that the number was not in service. What is it? Rachel was standing now, her face tight with concern. Someone just called saying she's Rebecca Hollis. She said she's injured at the campsite. Thomas's voice sounded distant to his own ears. Rachel, how would she have my cell number? She wouldn't. It's not publicly listed, and you weren't the assigned ranger until this morning. Rachel moved closer. What exactly did she say? Thomas repeated the conversation verbatim, and with each word, Rachel's expression grew more troubled. She used your name. Your first name. How would she know that? My name tag. She could have... But Thomas stopped because he remembered the tent with its entrance sealed shut. The complete absence of anyone at the campsite. No way Rebecca could have seen his name tag. No way she could have had his cell phone number. It's trying to lure you back, Rachel said flatly. That's what the folklore describes. The Nachtseher calls out in familiar voices, leaves signs of life, creates urgency that forces people to abandon caution. Thomas wanted to argue, but his hands were shaking again and he couldn't make them stop. If that was Rebecca on the phone and she's actually injured, I have a legal and ethical obligation. To do what? Get yourself killed? Rachel grabbed his arm. Thomas, listen to yourself. That call doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. You have to wait for Mitchell. But Thomas was already moving toward the door, his body operating on instinct and training that ran deeper than rational thought. An injured hiker had called for help. That was the only thing that mattered. The only thing that could matter. He'd taken an oath when he joined the Park Service. He'd also taken an oath 3 years ago. After the hiker he'd never found, he'd sworn he'd never let fear stop him from doing his job, never let superstition override responsibility. Rachel followed him to his truck, still arguing, but Thomas barely heard her. He was thinking about boot prints in mud, about disturbed earth, about the specific way Rebecca's voice had broken when she said, "I'm scared." He was thinking about how to approach the campsite safely, what equipment he needed, how to perform a rescue in failing light. He wasn't thinking about what might be waiting for him in the dark. Thomas drove the access road with his headlights cutting through gathering dusk. The forest had changed in the hours since he'd fled down the trail. The trees seemed to lean closer to the road, their moss-covered branches creating a tunnel that swallowed his headlights. He parked at the trailhead and gathered his gear: a powerful LED flashlight, his Motorola radio, first aid kit, rope, and a Mylar emergency blanket. He also grabbed something he'd never carried on duty before: a small vial of blessed water he'd kept in his glove compartment since that incident 3 years ago. He'd never told anyone about it, never even taken it out of the truck. He clipped it to his belt beside his bear spray. The Hoh River Trail was nearly invisible in the twilight. Thomas moved by flashlight, the beam creating a narrow tunnel of visibility that made the surrounding darkness feel infinite. Every sound seemed amplified: the drip of water from moss, the whisper of wind through needles, the steady rush of the river somewhere to his left. And underneath it all, so faint he almost convinced himself he was imagining it, that wet, rhythmic chewing. The campsite appeared suddenly in his flashlight beam, the green tent somehow luminous against the dark forest. The entrance was open, just as it had been when he'd fled that morning, but now a Coleman lantern glowed inside, casting dancing shadows against the nylon walls. "Rebecca," Thomas called out, his voice too loud in the silence. "Rebecca Hollis, this is Ranger Thomas Garrett. I'm here to help you." Movement inside the tent. A shadow against the illuminated fabric, human-shaped, hunched over. "Thomas." "Thank God. I'm in here. My leg. I think it's broken. Please help me." The voice was Rebecca's, he was sure of it. Young, frightened, strained with pain. But something in its tone set his teeth on edge, a flatness beneath the fear, as if someone were reading from a script they didn't quite understand. Thomas approached the tent slowly, his flashlight beam steady on the entrance. The smell hit him when he was 10 feet away. That same floral rot he'd detected earlier, but stronger now, thick enough to taste. His stomach clenched. "Rebecca, I'm going to need you to come toward the tent entrance where I can see you. Can you do that?" "I can't move my leg. Please, you have to come in here." Thomas stopped walking. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run, but he'd come here to help. And there was a woman inside that tent who might actually be injured. He played his flashlight over the campsite, noting details. The fire ring was exactly as he'd left it. The scattered supplies were in the same positions, but the cooking pot now contained something that steamed slightly in the cold air. And when his light caught the surface, he saw it was filled with a dark liquid that looked too thick to be water. "Rebecca, I'm going to approach the tent and assess your injury from the entrance. I need you to stay still and calm. Help is coming." "Help is coming," the voice repeated, and there was something wrong with the inflection, as if the words were being spoken backward and reversed. "Yes, help is coming. Thomas must come help. Come inside the tent, Thomas. Come see what's wrong with Rebecca's leg." Thomas felt his scalp tighten. The words were right, but the syntax was fractured, inhuman. He took a step back, his hand moving to his radio. "Rachel, if you're monitoring, I need immediate assistance at 5 Mile Island. I have a potential hostile situation." Static answered him. Pure white noise that resolved into a sound like fabric tearing, wet and deliberate. The lantern inside the tent went out. Thomas swung his flashlight toward the entrance and caught a glimpse of what crouched inside. Pale, yes, but not flesh. It was the color of grave cloth, of shroud material that had been underground for months. The face was Rebecca's face, but wrong. The features slightly misaligned, the mouth opened wider than human anatomy allowed, and in that mouth, he saw scraps of fabric, threads of nylon tent material caught between teeth that were too long and too sharp. It was eating the tent from the inside. The thing that wore Rebecca's face lunged forward, and Thomas ran. He crashed through the forest without following the trail, his flashlight beam jerking wildly across trees and ferns. Behind him, he heard the tent collapsing, the zipper shrieking as it was torn open from within, and then footsteps that moved too quickly, the stride length impossible for human legs. Thomas vaulted over a nurse log and nearly fell into the crater where the boot prints had ended. His flashlight caught the disturbed earth, and in its beam, he saw what his mind had refused to process that morning. The soil wasn't scratched from something clawing upward. It was a grave, deliberately dug, recently filled, and at its edge a scrap of blue fabric protruded from the earth. The same blue as Rebecca's stuff sack, the one that had spilled supplies across the moss. She'd been buried here, days ago, maybe longer, and something had dug its way out. The thing crashed through the undergrowth behind him, and Thomas saw it clearly now in his flashlight's backwash. It moved on all fours, spine arched at an angle that would have snapped human vertebrae. Its mouth worked constantly, chewing air, chewing the night itself. Strips of what might have been burial shroud trailed from its body, and its eyes were the flat black of river stones. Thomas's hand found the vial of blessed water without conscious thought. He unscrewed it as he backed away, the thing circling him now, patient, its mouth spreading wider with each second. When it lunged again, Thomas threw the water directly into its face. The Noxera screamed, a sound like cloth tearing and earth collapsing, and recoiled so violently it slammed into a tree trunk. The water left marks where it struck, the flesh beneath peeling away to reveal dried muscle and bone. But it didn't stop moving. It gathered itself, that terrible mouth opening impossibly wide, and Thomas saw down its throat into darkness that went deeper than a body should contain. He turned and ran toward the trail, his lungs burning, the Motorola at his belt producing nothing but that wet, tearing static. The Noxera followed, and now he could hear what Rachel's research had described. The sound of consumption, of something eating constantly, devouring cloth and flesh and the very air itself. Thomas burst onto the trail and saw lights ahead. Flashlight beams, multiple sources, and voices calling his name. Mitchell and his team had arrived early, probably radioed ahead by Rachel. Thomas ran toward them, shouting warnings they couldn't possibly understand. Behind him, the Noxera stopped at the trail's edge. In the crossing beams of multiple flashlights, Thomas saw it clearly for the first time. It wasn't Rebecca anymore, if it ever had been. It was something older, pieced together from the 4 hikers who'd vanished from 5 Mile Island over 26 years, wearing their faces like masks that didn't quite fit, wrapped in rotted burial cloth that it had consumed and regenerated countless times. It opened its mouth and screamed with 4 voices simultaneously, and then it retreated into the forest, moving on legs that bent the wrong direction, dragging strips of shroud that caught on ferns and tore free. Detective Mitchell grabbed Thomas's arm. Jesus Christ, what the hell was that? Thomas couldn't answer. His throat had closed. His hands were shaking violently, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he was screaming because he knew what would happen next. They'd search the campsite, find evidence that Rebecca had been there, maybe even find her body in that filled grave. But they wouldn't find the thing that had called him in her voice. It would retreat deeper into the forest, back to whatever hole it crawled from, and wait. Wait for October of next year, for another solo hiker. Another tent pitched at 5 Mile Island. The search took 3 days. They found Rebecca's body exactly where Thomas knew it would be, in the grave beneath the uprooted spruce. The medical examiner ruled it death by exposure, said she must have gotten disoriented in the dark, fallen into the crater, died of hypothermia. The weathered tent was removed as evidence. The scattered supplies were photographed and cataloged. The case was closed within a week. Thomas tried to explain what he'd seen, what had chased him through the forest. Mitchell listened politely, then suggested Thomas take some time off, maybe talk to someone about the stress of the job. Rachel backed up his story about the historical disappearances, but when pressed, she admitted the pattern could be coincidental. 4 people in 26 years wasn't statistically significant in a wilderness area that saw thousands of hikers annually. Nobody wanted to hear about Nachtterror. Nobody wanted to discuss German burial practices or folklore that insisted the dead could rise in places where plague had marked the earth. It was easier to believe that Thomas had suffered a panic attack, that he'd misidentified a bear or a mountain lion in the dark. That stress and isolation had made him see things that weren't there. Thomas accepted his administrative leave without argument. He cleaned out his desk at the visitor center, turned in his badge and radio, and drove away from Olympic National Park on a gray November morning. He didn't look back at the forest, but he thought about it constantly. He thought about the sound of chewing that had followed him from beneath the earth. He thought about Rebecca's voice on his cell phone, speaking words that formed sentences, but communicated nothing human. He thought about the 4 faces overlaid on that pale body, none of them quite fitting right, all of them screaming together as it retreated into darkness. Mostly, he thought about the next solo hiker who would come to 5 Mile Island in October. He thought about the campsite that would still be there, waiting, and the thing that had learned patience over 26 years, that knew how to whisper in familiar voices and leave signs that lured the living toward graves. Thomas had promised himself after that case 3 years ago that he would never let fear stop him from doing his job. But now he understood that some things in the forest were older than duty, older than courage, older than the human conviction that darkness could be illuminated. Some things had been feeding since before the first trees grew on this continent, consuming themselves and their victims in an endless cycle of death and resurrection. The Germans who'd fled this valley had known that. They'd understood that certain ground was cursed, that plague could mark the earth in ways that persisted long after the bodies were buried. They'd abandoned their settlement and never returned, leaving their dead to rot in unconsecrated graves. And what rose from those graves was still here, still hungry, still chewing itself, and anyone who came too close, wrapped in shrouds, it had consumed and regenerated for over a century. Thomas lives in Seattle now. He works security at a corporate office building, a job that keeps him indoors under fluorescent lights where nothing unexpected can happen. He doesn't hike anymore. He doesn't visit forests. When people ask about his time with the Park Service, he says it was rewarding, but he'd needed a change. He doesn't mention that he still wakes at 3 a.m. to the sound of wet chewing, or that sometimes his cell phone rings with numbers that aren't in service, or that he keeps blessed water beside his bed like medicine he hopes he'll never need. He doesn't mention that he still checks the news from Olympic National Park, watching for reports of missing hikers in October, solo campers who vanish from 5 Mile Island. The reports come every few years now, not annually, not predictably, but often enough. And each time Thomas reads the details and sees the same pattern. Tent found intact, supplies scattered, no body recovered until days later when they search the crater beneath the uprooted spruce. Each time, he considers calling the Park Service, warning whoever responds to the scene. But what would he say? What warning could possibly prepare someone for what waits in that forest? So Thomas says nothing. He goes to his security job, checks his locks twice before sleeping, and tries not to think about the forest holding its breath. But sometimes, in the gray space between sleep and waking, he hears it clearly. That wet, rhythmic chewing, patient and endless. The sound of something that has learned to wait, and he knows it's still there, wrapped in its shroud, consuming itself in the dark earth beneath the Hoh rainforest, waiting for October, waiting for the next voice to call out from its mouth, the next lure to work, waiting to feed again on whatever comes too close to graves that should have stayed sealed. The Noctera is patient. It has time. The forest has time. And sooner or later, someone always comes to 5 Mile Island alone. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Daniel Crowley had learned early in his career that the forest spoke in frequencies most people couldn't hear. Not literal voices. He wasn't delusional, despite what the psychological evaluation after the Wenatchee incident had implied, but rhythms and absences that registered somewhere behind his sternum. A tuning fork that hummed wrong when something displaced the natural order. On the morning he hiked toward Rachel Hartman's last known location, that internal instrument vibrated with a pitch he'd never felt before. Something that made his back teeth ache and the coffee in his stomach turn acidic. The Cascade Pass trailhead sat at 3,600 feet, wreathed in October fog that reduced visibility to maybe 30 yards. Daniel adjusted the weight of his pack. Garmin GPS unit, first aid kit, evidence bags, Motorola radio that would be useless once he got deeper into the terrain, and studied the parking area. Rachel's silver Honda CR-V sat exactly where it had been for 4 days now. Driver's side window cracked 2 inches, registration current. Nothing outwardly wrong except that its owner had vanished as completely as if the mountain had swallowed her whole. She was the third. First had been Marcus Webb in late July. Experienced climber. Found nothing but his camp stove still burning at a site near Sahaley Arm. Then Jennifer Costas in mid-September. Solo backpacker. Her tent discovered perfectly erected with her sleeping bag laid out. Boots lined up outside. Pack organized with the precision of someone who'd just stepped away for a moment and intended to return. Except she hadn't. And now Rachel, 29, environmental scientist. Someone who knew these mountains as well as Daniel did, gone without the scream or struggle that should have echoed through these valleys. Supervisor Hayes had dismissed the pattern. People get lost, get hurt, fall. That's the job, Crowley. We look, we search, we usually find them eventually. But Hayes hadn't been there when they'd found Jennifer's site. Hadn't seen how her food bag hung perfectly in the bear-proof configuration, how her journal lay open to a half-finished entry that ended mid-sentence. The light through the hemlocks at dusk has a quality I've never seen before, almost like what? Daniel had touched the page, and that tuning fork sensation had spiked so sharply he'd nearly vomited. The trail climbed immediately, switchbacking through old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock. At this elevation in late October, the underbrush had died back to rust and gray, but the canopy remained dense enough to trap the fog in layers that shifted with a logic independent of wind. Daniel's boots found the rhythm of ascent, muscle memory from a decade of ranger work, but his attention scattered across 1,000 small wrong details. A raven's call that cut off too abruptly. Kinnikinic berries that should have been picked clean by now still clinging to their stems. The absolute absence of squirrel chatter in forest that should have been alive with pre-winter hoarding behavior. He'd grown up in rural Oregon, the youngest of 5 kids in a household that didn't have patience for anything that couldn't be explained. When he'd told his mother at age 7 that he could feel when deer were near before seeing them, could sense when winter would be harsh by the way September air tasted, she'd told him he was being fanciful. His high school girlfriend had broken up with him after he'd refused to go into an abandoned barn near Tillamook, unable to articulate why every cell in his body screamed wrongness when she'd wanted to explore. The Army had been better. Snipers learned to trust instinct. But after his discharge, civilian life required constant translation of gut feelings into acceptable rational frameworks. The National Park Service had been a compromise. In wilderness, intuition could masquerade as expertise. By the time Daniel reached 4,800 feet, 2 hours into the hike, the fog had thickened into something with texture, damp enough to beat on his jacket, but not quite rain. The GPS showed he was a half-mile from Rachel's campsite, located just off trail near the basin, where snowmelt formed the headwaters of the Stehekin River. He'd studied her itinerary a dozen times. She'd planned 5 days alone studying high-altitude lichens, a research project for the university. Responsible, prepared. Someone who'd filed a detailed trip plan and carried 2 forms of emergency communication. Both her satellite phone and personal locator beacon had been found in her tent, powered on, fully functional. The wrongness intensified as he approached the coordinates. Not a sound now, not even wind, though he could see branches swaying in his peripheral vision. The fog had taken on a bluish cast, the color of meat left too long in weak refrigeration. Daniel's breathing had gone shallow, each inhalation requiring conscious effort, and his hands had started trembling in a way that had nothing to do with exertion or cold. Rachel's tent materialized from the fog like a photograph developing. A green 4-season mountain hardware, expensive and properly staked, rainfly taut. The site had been cordoned off with Park Service tape after the initial search team had documented everything, but Daniel ducked under it now, moving with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a sleeping predator. The tent's vestibule held her boots. Women's size 7. Vasca hiking boots, laces still tied, positioned as if she'd simply stepped out of them. Her trekking poles leaned against a nearby hemlock. Inside the tent, Daniel unzipped the fly with fingers that wouldn't stay steady. Her belongings remained in perfect order. Sleeping bag unrolled but not slept in. Camp stove assembled, lichen samples in labeled containers, notebook with entries dated up to October 18th, the day before she'd failed to check in. He'd read the last entry in the case file, but seeing it in context in her cramped handwriting that slanted slightly right, made something in his chest constrict. Hearing something in the forest after dark. Not animal movement. I know animal movement. This is deliberate, circling. Whatever it is, it's patient. It's waiting for something, and I think it knows I can hear it. Daniel sat back on his heels, fighting the urge to flee. The initial search team had found no tracks, no signs of struggle, no blood. The working theory was that Rachel had gone out to relieve herself in the night and become disoriented, though that theory ignored her experience and the fact that her headlamp remained in the tent, still functional. It ignored what Daniel could feel radiating from this place like heat from coals. He photographed everything again, knowing Hayes would demand documentation. Even though nothing had changed, the light was starting to fail. It was only 3 p.m., but the fog had brought premature dusk. He should hike back down, return with a larger team in the morning. That was protocol. That was sensible. Instead, Daniel found himself studying the tree line, trying to identify what his nervous system was screaming about. The hemlocks and firs stood in their typical distribution, no obvious disturbances. But there, maybe 40 yards north, a gap in the fog that seemed darker than it should be. A vertical shadow that didn't correspond to any trunk thick enough to create that silhouette. He stood slowly, hand moving to the radio on his belt in a useless gesture. No signal here. Wouldn't be signal for another 1,000 feet of elevation at least. The Motorola was dead weight, comfort object, talisman against the exact situation he now found himself in. The shadow didn't move, but Daniel's perception of it sharpened, the way optical illusions suddenly resolve into coherent images. Not a tree, a figure. Tall enough to be a man, still enough to be a statue, but organic in a way that made his mouth go dry. "Hello?" His voice came out strangled. Professional protocol demanded he identify himself, offer assistance. "Park Service. Are you injured?" Nothing, but that tuning fork sensation had become a shriek, and Daniel's vision was starting to tunnel. He'd experienced panic attacks before, controlled them through breathing exercises and cognitive reframing, but this was different. This was his entire evolutionary history lighting up every alarm system, screaming predator, screaming run, screaming wrong, wrong, wrong. He stepped toward the figure, later trying to explain this decision to himself. Daniel would understand it as the same impulse that made prey animals freeze rather than flee, that made people walk toward danger in dreams. Some part of him needed to know what he was looking at, needed to resolve the cognitive dissonance between human shape and the absolute certainty that whatever stood in those trees was not human at all. At 30 yards, details began to emerge. Pale skin, possibly Caucasian, definitely male, dark clothing, possibly a jacket or heavy coat, hair that might have been black or simply darkened by moisture. The figure faced him, or seemed to, though Daniel couldn't make out features through the fog. At 20 yards, the figure moved. Not a startle or flinch. A deliberate step backward, receding into the forest with the fluid ease of something that knew every root and stone. Daniel's lizard brain wanted him to interpret this as retreat, but the rational part recognized it as invitation. "Sir, I need you to identify yourself." The ranger voice, the authority voice, the voice that usually worked on lost hikers and belligerent campers. It sounded pathetic even to his own ears. "I'm investigating a missing person. If you have information..." The figure was gone. Not faded, not obscured, simply no longer there, as if it had never existed outside Daniel's perception. But the space where it had stood retained a quality, an absence that was somehow more present than presence. And now Daniel could smell something, not strong but distinctive. Turned earth and copper, the scent of a root cellar or a grave. He should go back. Radio for support from somewhere with signal. Return with backup, equipment, rational minds that would tell him he'd seen a lost hiker or a trick of light. Should never, under any circumstances, follow an unknown figure into remote wilderness as darkness approached. Daniel followed. The forest floor showed no tracks, but he didn't need tracks. That internal instrument pulled him north, away from the trail, into sections of old growth that predated American occupation, that had been ancient when the first European explorers had mapped this range. The hemlocks here grew massive, 8 feet across, their root structures creating a maze of hollows and channels. The fog moved strangely around their trunks, as if repelled by some property of the bark. After perhaps 10 minutes, though his sense of time had become unreliable, Daniel found the structure. Not a building exactly, more a deliberate arrangement of stone and wood, partially collapsed but clearly artificial. The foundation of something, dug into a hillside, timbers rotting but still visible. A mine entrance perhaps, or the remnants of a prospector's shelter. He'd known the Cascades had seen mining activity in the early 1900s, mostly played out claims that had never produced enough silver or copper to justify the infrastructure. But he'd never heard of anything this far into what was now designated wilderness. The gap in the hillside descended at a sharp angle, reinforced with hand-hewn timbers that somehow hadn't completely rotted despite a century of exposure. The smell was stronger here, and underneath the mineral scent Daniel detected something else. Spoiled meat, but old, desiccated rather than putrid. His headlamp beam penetrated maybe 15 feet before the passage curved. Water sounds echoed from below, not flowing but dripping, the slow percussion of groundwater finding its level. And something else. Rhythm that might have been his own pulse amplified by stone acoustics, or might have been breathing. Rachel? Her name emerged as barely a whisper. Rachel Hartman? The response came not as sound but as sensation. A pressure change that made his ears pop, a coldness that bypassed his skin and settled directly into his marrow. And then, from deep in the mine, a voice. Female. Weak. Help me. Every survival instinct Daniel possessed screamed this was wrong. The voice was too distant, too hollow. Rachel had been missing 4 days in October conditions. She'd be hypothermic, dehydrated, likely delirious. She wouldn't be in an abandoned mine shaft. This was lure, trap, predation strategy. But what if it wasn't? What if she'd fallen, crawled into shelter, survived through sheer will? What if he left now and she died because he'd trusted his irrational panic over the possibility of rescue? Daniel descended into the mine. The timber supports groaned as he passed, and his headlamp caught veins of quartz in the granite walls, glittering like embedded ice. The temperature dropped rapidly, 50 degrees at the entrance, maybe 40 by the time the passage leveled out. His breath plumed white. The dripping water had formed icicles in places, unusual for early October but possible at this elevation. The main chamber opened abruptly, large enough that his headlamp couldn't find the far walls. Timbers here had been worked more carefully, mortised joints and hand-forged nails. Someone had planned to stay, to extract whatever they'd believed the mountain held. Mining equipment lay scattered, oxidized and broken. A pickaxe with its handle rotted away. A lantern whose glass had shattered decades ago and Daniel's light fixed on it. A book. Not a ledger or mining log. A book bound in cracked leather, pages yellowed and foxed but intact. He recognized it instantly. Recognized the woodcut illustration on the exposed page. A protective circle with Hebrew characters, a diagram for binding spirits. He'd seen similar images in his grandfather's library, back when he'd been trying to understand why he could feel things others couldn't. Had briefly entertained the idea that folklore and superstition might be corrupted records of real phenomena. This was a grimoire, specifically if he was reading the marginalia correctly, a working copy of the Key of Solomon, annotated in what looked like Romanian. Help me, please. The voice came from Daniel's left, from a side passage he hadn't noticed. Smaller than the main shaft, barely wide enough for a person. Rachel's voice, he thought, though something about the timbre was off, too resonant for someone in extremis. He should not go farther. Every rational thought demanded retreat, but his hand was already moving to his pack, finding the spare flashlight, the first aid kit, the emergency blanket. Because what if? What if his instincts were wrong, paranoid, the product of stress and sleep deprivation. What if she was there, just beyond the light, waiting for someone to be brave enough? The side passage sloped down. More ice here, formations that looked less like natural freezing and more like something had deliberately sculpted them. The walls narrowed until Daniel's shoulders brushed stone on both sides and his breathing echoed too loud, too fast. The smell was overwhelming now. That root cellar scent mixed with something that reminded him of the slaughterhouse his uncle had worked at, where blood was always fresh but also always old, soaked into concrete past any possibility of cleaning. And then he saw her. Rachel Hartman sat against the far wall of a small chamber, legs extended, arms at her sides. She wore the same fleece and hiking pants described in the missing person report. Her auburn hair hung in tangles around her face, and she was looking at him with eyes that caught his headlamp beam and reflected it back red, like a deer on a roadside, like something that had never been human at all. "Thank you for coming," she said, and smiled with too many teeth. Daniel's body tried to run before his conscious mind processed what he was seeing. But his legs wouldn't obey, locked rigid by some mechanism he'd only read about. The prey paralysis that hijacked the nervous system when fleeing meant certain death. He could only stand there, trembling, as the thing wearing Rachel Hartman's shape rose with a fluidity that violated biomechanics. "You can feel it, can't you?" Not Rachel's voice now, something older, accent that could have been Eastern European, but felt older than modern language. "You've always felt it. The boundaries, where life stops and..." The smile widened impossibly. "Continues. What are you?" Daniel's voice was steady, somehow. Combat training surfacing through terror, the mechanical responses that survive when thought fails. Strigoi. The word carried weight, history, centuries of fear compressed into 4 syllables. Your people have many names. Dead that walk, blood drinker. But those are crude. I am completion. The hunger that proves death was never final. The thing stepped closer, and Daniel could see now what his initial shock had prevented him from processing. Rachel's body showed evidence of something feeding, not dramatically, not Hollywood exsanguination, but careful, methodical drainage. Her skin had the translucent quality of advanced dehydration, but the veins showed dark beneath, as if ink instead of blood moved through them. She is gone, if that's what you're wondering. The Strigoi cocked its head, a movement too angular to be natural. The Romanian miners who worked here century past, they knew the rituals, knew how to keep us dormant. But rituals need maintenance, need belief. It gestured to the main chamber. The last one died in 1932, tuberculosis. His book of protection died with him, until your Rachel found this place, disturbed what should have stayed buried. Daniel's hand had found his belt, fingers closing on the canister of bear spray he carried. Useless against a bear, probably. Utterly useless against this, but the human need to hold a weapon transcended logic. The others? He managed. Learning. The Strigoi's smile never wavered. Understanding the new age, the new methods. Your technology makes hunting easier. People wander alone now, confident in their radios and satellites. They don't carry the old protections. No garlic, no prayer, no knowledge that certain deaths don't end, they transform. It was directly in front of him now, close enough that Daniel could see his reflection in those red eyes, could smell the mineral wrongness of its breath. Close enough that he understood with absolute clarity that he was going to die in this mine, would be reported as another disappearance, would feed this thing until there was nothing left of Daniel Crowley but a puppet that wore his face. But you're different, the Strigoi said, almost gently. You perceive. That makes you valuable, not as food. It reached out and Daniel felt fingers that were too cold touch his cheek. As companion. The sensitive ones, when turned, they become remarkable. The touch broke his paralysis. Daniel threw himself backward, hit stone hard enough to see stars, and had the bear spray out and firing in one motion. The stream caught the Strigoi full in the face, capsaicin concentration designed to stop a grizzly. It didn't even blink. But Daniel was already moving, terror overriding the paralysis, scrambling back through the narrow passage. He heard laughter behind him, not cruel but delighted, like a parent watching a child's first steps. The sound followed him through the twisting mine, echoing from walls and ceiling until it seemed to come from everywhere. He fell twice climbing out, skinned his palms raw on granite and rotten timber, and didn't stop moving even when he burst into the fog-shrouded evening. His headlamp had died or been left behind, but his eyes had adjusted to darkness, and muscle memory found the trail through sheer desperation. Behind him, the forest had come alive with motion. Not the strigoi. He couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but his body knew it was there, tracking him with the patient precision of something that had all the time in the world. It could have caught him in the mine, could have taken him in those first moments of paralysis. But it had chosen not to, and that was somehow more terrifying than immediate attack. It was playing. Daniel's radio crackled to life at 5,200 feet. Hayes' voice cutting through static. Crowley, respond. Getting dark. Need your status. Contact. The word came out between gasping breaths as he stumbled higher. Multiple disappearances connected. Suspect stalking. He couldn't say it. Couldn't force the word strigoi through his lips without sounding insane. Victim compromised. Need immediate evacuation, and the radio died. Not gradually, not static. Just instantly dead, as if something had reached through the frequencies and silenced it. Daniel kept climbing. The fog had lifted slightly, and through gaps he could see the ridgeline, maybe a half-mile distant. If he could reach the pass, get to the other side, maybe... What? Outrun something that had been hunting these mountains for a century? Something that Rachel's notes suggested had claimed at least 3 victims, probably more before those, a slow but patient accumulation. He topped a rise and saw it ahead of him on the trail, not hiding now, not pretending. The strigoi stood fully formed in the twilight, and Daniel's mind finally accepted what it was seeing, still wearing Rachel's body like an ill-fitting coat. But the proportions were wrong now, elongated in ways that suggested the thing inside was too large for its container. The eyes reflected what little light remained, and when it smiled, the teeth went back too far, multiple rows that belonged in a shark's mouth. "You run well," it said conversationally. "The fearful ones always do, but you know." It took a step forward, and Daniel watched his own death approaching. "I can smell your grandfather on you. The belief in old things, the knowing. When you turn, you'll be magnificent." Daniel's hand found something in his jacket pocket. Not a weapon, not anything useful. The small silver cross his grandmother had given him when he joined the army, worn to tarnish, probably worthless even symbolically since he'd never held much faith, but his grandmother had believed, had crossed herself at every thunderstorm and Christmas. And her mother had emigrated from Poland carrying it through Ellis Island. He pulled it out more from defiance than hope, held it up with a hand that shook so badly the chain clinked. The strigoi's smile faltered, not dramatically, not the Hollywood recoil and hissing, but its eyes flicked to the cross, and for the first time, something like uncertainty crossed its stolen features. It took a step back. "Interesting," it said, and Daniel heard genuine surprise. "Still charged, through generations, still carrying..." It cocked its head again, that inhuman angle. "You don't even believe," but she did. Intent matters, always matters. Daniel held the cross higher, hope and terror mixing into something like hysteria. The strigoi regarded him for a long moment, rain beginning to fall now, cold enough that it might turn to sleet. Then it smiled again, different this time, almost approving. "Keep it," it said. "But understand, protection is temporary. Faith fades. The cross will lose its charge year or 2, maybe 3, and I am patient." It gestured to the forest, the mountains, the endless wilderness. "This is my territory now. All of it. And you." Those red eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made Daniel's knees weak. "You are marked. I'll know when the protection fails. I'll feel it." Then it was gone, not vanishing but simply stepping sideways into fog that shouldn't have been thick enough to hide anything. Daniel stood alone on the trail, clutching his grandmother's cross, rain turning to sleet that stung his face, the dark coming down like a dropped curtain. He didn't remember hiking out. His next clear memory was the trailhead parking lot, his hands shaking too badly to unlock his truck, Hayes's voice on the radio asking for confirmation of safe return. The timestamp on his GPS showed 4 hours had passed, but it had felt like 15 minutes or 15 years. Hayes met him at the ranger station, took one look at his face, and didn't ask questions until Daniel had consumed 2 cups of coffee and stopped shaking visibly. When he finally spoke, Daniel found himself telling a version that was true but incomplete. He'd found evidence Rachel had explored an old mine, possible structural collapse, needed a specialized recovery team and forensic investigation. He didn't mention the Strigoi, didn't mention the conversation or the promise or the certainty that had settled into his bones like radiation. The official report called it possible foul play, suspect at large. Search teams found the mine but nothing in it except old equipment and that book, which Park Service quietly removed and never mentioned again. Rachel Hartman was eventually declared legally dead. Marcus Webb and Jennifer Costas remained open cases. Daniel requested and received a transfer to Olympic National Park 2 months later. Hayes didn't fight it, probably relieved to be rid of a ranger who'd returned from a search mission looking like he'd aged a decade. But Daniel knew distance meant nothing. The Strigoi had marked him, could find him anywhere, was simply waiting for the invisible charge to drain from a tarnished cross. He started attending church. Not from faith, he still couldn't quite believe, but from hope that proximity to belief might maintain whatever protection his grandmother's devotion had created. He had the cross reinforced, blessed by 3 different denominations, and never took it off. At night, he researched Strigoi folklore, protection rituals, the miners who'd worked the Cascades, their names and origins. He found records of Romanian workers, found obituaries from the 1920s and 30s, found mention of strange deaths attributed to altitude sickness or exposure. And he felt it, always, that tuning fork sensation that had once warned him about wrong places and dangerous animals. Now it hummed with a specific frequency, an awareness of something patient and hungry, waiting in the wilderness for the inevitable moment when protection would fail, and Daniel Crowley would learn what it meant to continue. On the first anniversary of Rachel Hartman's disappearance, he received an envelope at his new posting. No return address, postmarked from a town near North Cascades. Inside, a single photograph of the Cascade Pass trailhead, taken recently based on the snow levels, and written on the back in handwriting that matched Rachel's notebook, "I'm still here." Daniel keeps the cross on, attends services, researches obsessively. But he knows, in that place behind his sternum where the forest speaks its truths, that protection is never permanent, that the Strigoi meant every word, that somewhere in the wilderness something patient and ancient is waiting for a charge to fade, for faith to waver, for the inevitable moment when the sensitive ones always finally see too much. He just doesn't know if that moment will come in years or decades. Doesn't know if he'll feel it approaching or if it will arrive like the fog, sudden and absolute. But he carries the cross, maintains the rituals, and never ever hikes alone anymore. Though even that feels like superstition against something that's already inside his awareness, permanent as a scar. The forest still speaks to him. He still hears its frequencies. But now there's another voice in the static, patient and amused, counting down the days until Daniel Crowley stops being the hunter and becomes the hunted. Until the sensitive one who could always perceive the boundary between life and death learns exactly what exists on the other side. And some nights, when sleep finally comes, Daniel dreams of the mine. Dreams of descending through stone into chambers that shouldn't exist, following a voice that promises understanding, promises completion. Dreams of red eyes and too many teeth and the cold certainty that everything he's feared his whole life was right. The warnings were true, and protection was always just the space between breaths before the inevitable. He wakes from these dreams clutching the cross, feeling its weight, wondering if the charge is weaker than yesterday, if today is the day the protection finally fails. So far it hasn't. So far, the Strigoi keeps its promise to wait. But Daniel knows patient predators never forget, never forgive, never stop hunting, and he's running out of time. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Rob Henderson had stopped questioning the forest 20 years ago. That was his first mistake. The morning of October 14, 2007 began like any of the 7,000 mornings before it. Coffee at 5:47 a.m., weather check at 6:15, patrol truck inspection at 6:30. The Olympic National Park Southwestern District knew his patterns better than his ex-wife ever had. 19 years wearing the green and gray had carved routines into him the way the Salduke River carved through ancient stone. Patient, inevitable, permanent. He signed out at the Hoh Rainforest Ranger Station with barely a glance at Jenny Whitehorse, the Quileute liaison officer who'd been assigned there 3 months back. She watched him with that unsettling intensity some of the tribal staff had, like she could see the forest breathing through the walls. "Henderson," she said as he shouldered his pack, "you heading up to check on that research camp? Crawford's site?" "Yeah, 4 days overdue on her check-in." He adjusted the Motorola radio on his belt, the weight familiar as his own spine. Probably just dead batteries. These grad students never pack enough spares. Jenny's fingers drummed against her desk, a rhythm that didn't match anything playing on her computer speakers. The Crawford woman. What was she studying? Nurse log decomposition rates, fungal succession patterns, something about mycorrhizal networks. Rob shrugged. "Above my pay grade. I just make sure they don't start forest fires or fall off cliffs." "She ask you about any of the traditional sites up there?" "Traditional sites?" "Old growth groves, the ones with the cultural modifications." Jenny's eyes hadn't left his face. "The witness trees." Rob felt the familiar tightness in his shoulders that came whenever the conversation drifted into what he privately called the mythology zone. "Look, Jenny, I respect your heritage and all that, but I've got 12 miles to cover before the weather turns. If she violated any cultural protection protocols, we'll address it in the report. Just watch yourself up there, Henderson." Jenny turned back to her screen, but her reflection in the monitor was still staring at him. "That section of the Hoh, it's old. Really old. Grandmother trees. And not all of them are happy about the attention." Rob managed not to roll his eyes until he was outside. The October sky hung low and gray over the temperate rainforest, that particular shade of Pacific Northwest overcast that could mean drizzle or downpour without warning. The trailhead thermometer read 47 degrees. He logged the reading in his notebook, an analog habit from before the Park Service went digital, one he'd never shaken. Some things you wanted in ink and paper, immune to battery failure. The Hoh Rainforest Trail stretched east into green twilight. Rob had walked this path hundreds of times, knew every root hump and mudslick, every cathedral grove of Sitka spruce rising 200 feet into the mist. Nurse logs thick as cars lay decomposing under blankets of moss that glowed almost fluorescent in the filtered light. The air tasted of rot and growth, that peculiar smell of things dying and being born in the same breath. Melissa Crawford's research site sat 3 miles in, just past the junction with the Salduke Divide Trail at approximately 2,400 feet elevation. Rob's Garmin GPS, a clunky yellow brick compared to what would come later, but cutting edge for 2007, showed him making good time. The trail was empty. Mid-October weekday meant tourist season was dead, which was how he liked it. He'd met Melissa once briefly when she'd pulled her permit 6 weeks back. 26, earnest, one of those intense academic types who talked about soil chemistry like it was poetry. University of Washington doctoral candidate. Her faculty advisor had signed off on everything, all the paperwork pristine. She'd seemed competent enough, experienced with backcountry camping. No red flags, but 4 days without contact, that was a red flag. Especially when the weather had been clear and her satellite check-in dates were marked in the permit log with the kind of precision that suggested she wasn't the flaky type. The forest pressed close on both sides. hemlocks and cedars so thick the trail felt like a tunnel boring through green flesh. Somewhere overhead, a raven made a sound like wet wood splitting. Rob's boots found their rhythm, the automatic pace of a man who'd walked 10,000 miles on trails like this. His mind wandered to the report he'd have to file, the probability that this would turn into a full SAR deployment if she wasn't just sleeping off food poisoning in her tent. He almost missed the first marker. It was Melissa's, had to be. Orange surveyor's tape tied around a hemlock trunk, about chest height. Standard practice for marking research sites. But there was something else tied there too. Something that made Rob stop. A small bundle of cedar bark, woven in a tight spiral pattern, hung from the same branch. The weaving was intricate, deliberate. Fresh enough that the bark still had color. Rob touched it with one gloved finger. The bark was soft, almost damp, despite 3 days of dry weather. He left it and kept walking, but the rhythm of his stride had broken. More markers appeared over the next half-mile, growing more frequent. Always orange tape, sometimes with coordinates written in Melissa's precise handwriting. But increasingly, other things appeared alongside them. More cedar bark bundles, arrangements of stones that looked too deliberate to be natural. At one point, a circle of moss had been carefully cleared from a nurse log, exposing the pale wood beneath in a pattern that resembled a handprint, a very large handprint. The research camp materialized around a bend like a set piece from an abandoned play. One orange dome tent sagging slightly, a blue tarp strung between trees covering a makeshift work area, plastic bins with weatherproof lids, a camp stove, a bare hang rope dangling empty from a high branch. No Melissa. Crawford. Rob's voice sounded wrong in the green silence, too loud and too flat at the same time. Melissa Crawford, this is Ranger Henderson. Are you in the area? Nothing answered except the forest's constant drip and whisper. Rob approached the tent with his hand resting unconsciously on his radio. The zipper was closed, the rain fly properly secured. He called out twice more before opening it. The sleeping bag was there, neatly arranged. A headlamp hung from the tent's ceiling loop. Spare batteries, protein bar wrappers, a paperback thriller with a bookmark halfway through. All normal. All wrong. Because she wouldn't have left this organized if she'd been here when something went bad. Under the tarp, her research station was more disturbing. The camp stove had a pot of something that might have been oatmeal, now fuzzy with mold. 4 days' worth, maybe. A laptop sat closed on a plastic bin, solar charger cable still attached. Rob didn't touch it. Evidence protocols if this went to search and rescue or worse. But her field notebooks were right there. 3 spiral-bound books, stacked with the methodical care of someone who understood data was sacred. He opened the top one. The first 40 pages were exactly what he'd expect. Detailed observations of fungal growth patterns, measurements of soil composition, hand-drawn diagrams of mycorrhizal networks with annotations in technical language that meant nothing to him. Her handwriting was small, precise, obsessively neat. Then around page 45, the handwriting changed. The observations were still there, but shorter, more fragmented. Between the scientific notes, other things appeared. Oct 7, something large moving through camp perimeter last night. No visual, nothing on the game camera, checked twice, but definitely something. Weight enough to snap deadfall. Didn't sound like elk. Oct 8, the humming, started around 2 a.m., very low frequency, almost subsonic. Felt it in my chest before I heard it. Lasted maybe 10 minutes. Nothing on the recording equipment. How is there nothing on the recording equipment? Oct 9. Found all my plot markers rearranged. Not moved. Rearranged. They're in a different pattern now, but still marking my exact research plots. Something is paying attention to what I'm doing. Rob's thumb rubbed unconsciously at the worn spot on his radio's talk button. This wasn't right. Environmental science PhDs didn't have psychotic breaks over forest sounds. Did they? He flipped forward. The entries grew stranger. Oct 10. It's testing me. I know how that sounds, but every time I set up a plot, every time I take a core sample, I find adjustments when I come back. Moss arranged in patterns, stones placed on my equipment, Once one of my soil samples had been opened. The cap removed, the soil replaced with something else. Cedar bark, woven into a spiral. Below this, she'd drawn something. A rough sketch of what looked like a large woven basket, cone-shaped, with a wide rim. The drawing was hasty, dark, pressed so hard the pencil had torn through the paper in places. Oct 11. I know what I did. The bark. I shouldn't have taken it from the witness tree. Jenny tried to warn me. Not directly, she couldn't, regulations or whatever. But she tried. The tree with the cultural modifications, the one with the old scars. I just wanted a small sample to compare the chemical composition with the surrounding... Christ, I sound like I'm justifying theft. That's what it was, theft. And something knows. The humming is every night now, closer, and I've started to smell something when it happens. Not decay exactly, more like very old wood, cedar that's been wet for a long time, and something else underneath, something that makes my hindbrain scream. The last entry was dated October 12th, 2 days ago. It's testing me, waiting to see if I'll return what I took, or if I'm just another greedy person who takes without asking. I found the bark bundle I cut hanging from my tent skyline this morning. How the fuck did it get there? I burned it. I know I burned it 3 days ago, watched it turn to ash in my camp stove, but there it was, perfectly intact, hanging exactly at eye level so I couldn't miss it. The humming started before dawn. I could hear it breathing this time. Something that big, breathing that low, rhythmic. I think it was standing about 30 feet from my tent. I didn't look. I just lay there until sunrise. I'm leaving today. I don't care about the research, don't care about my PhD. I'll come back with a tribal elder, with Jenny, with whoever I need to bring to make this right. I'll perform whatever ceremony or apology they require, but I need to get out first. If anyone finds this, the witness tree is approximately 400 meters northeast of this camp, bearing 045 degrees. The bark I took is in the small cedar box in my pack's top pocket. Return it, with respect, and don't go looking for what lives in the deep groves. It's old, and it remembers when humans knew better than to take without asking. The entry ended there, mid-page. The rest of the notebook was blank. Rob set it down carefully, his hands steadier than they had any right to be. 20 years of practice ignoring the parts of the forest that didn't fit into his understanding. 20 years of rational explanations for missing hikers, of logical reasons for unexplained sounds, of weather and wildlife and human error accounting for everything that happened under the green canopy. 20 years of being wrong. He keyed his radio. Station, this is Henderson. I'm at the Crawford research site. Subject is not present. Camp appears abandoned as of 2 days ago. No signs of struggle, but... He paused, weighing his words. Situation is unusual. I'm going to do a preliminary search of the immediate area, then I'll need to request SAR protocols if I don't locate her within the hour. Static. Then Jenny's voice. Copy, Henderson. What makes it unusual? Field notes indicate subject was experiencing stress, possibly disorientation. I'll know more after the search. Henderson. Jenny's voice had changed. Did she mention the witness trees? He looked at the notebook. Yeah, she did. The silence stretched so long Rob thought he'd lost the signal. Then, don't go looking for what she found. Get back to the station. We'll send a proper team. I'm already here, Jenny. Standard protocol is to conduct initial search before escalating. Protocol doesn't cover everything that lives in the old growth, Henderson. Radio check at 15-minute intervals, he said, and released the talk button before she could argue. The bearing was simple enough. 45 degrees northeast, 400 meters. Rob's compass was military surplus, accurate and reliable. The Garmin GPS backed it up, though he trusted the compass more. Batteries failed, satellites lost signal, but magnetism was honest. He left the camp and started into the trackless forest. Here, away from the maintained trail, the hoe revealed its true nature. This wasn't the gentle postcard version tourists photographed. This was the primordial thing beneath, the green machine that had been growing since before humans crossed the land bridge. Nurse logs the size of buses, so covered in moss and ferns they looked like topographical features rather than dead trees. Hemlocks twisted in impossible spirals, following light that filtered down through 200 feet of canopy. Everything dripped. Everything rotted. Everything grew. The witness tree found him as much as he found it. It stood in a small clearing, though clearing wasn't quite right, more like a space the forest had agreed to leave open. A western red cedar, old growth, maybe 8 feet in diameter at the base. The trunk showed scars from traditional bark harvesting, long vertical strips that had healed over decades or centuries ago. The Quileute and other coastal peoples had practiced sustainable bark harvesting for thousands of years, taking only what they needed, always leaving the tree alive. But one scar was fresh, recent, crude. Someone, Melissa, had cut away a section of bark without the knowledge or respect the practice required. The wound wept sap, amber against the reddish bark, and hanging from a low branch, exactly at eye level, was Melissa Crawford's green backpack. Rob approached it slowly, every instinct from 20 years of backcountry work suddenly awake and screaming. The pack hung by one strap, swaying slightly despite no wind. He reached for it with hands that wanted to shake and wouldn't be allowed to. Not yet. Not until he was somewhere with walls and electric lights and other people. The pack was heavy. Melissa's name was written in Sharpie on the top flap. Rob lowered it to the moss and opened it. Everything was there. Satellite phone, GPS unit, water bottles, first aid kit, the small cedar box she'd mentioned, containing a spiral of bark that practically hummed with wrongness. Everything you'd need to hike out of the forest. Everything except the person who'd been carrying it. He keyed his radio. Station, Henderson. I've located Crawford's pack, approximately 400 meters northeast of her camp. No sign of Crawford herself. The pack appears to have been placed deliberately. Placed? Hanging from a tree. No signs of predation, no blood, no struggle. Just placed. Jenny's voice came through tight. Get out of there, right now. I need to establish a search perimeter. Henderson, listen to me. You're not going to find her by searching. She's gone. Gone where? Taken. That's the old word for it. Taken. When people violate the protocols, when they take without permission, without ceremony. Her voice fractured slightly. The forest has rules, Rob. Old rules. Older than the Park Service. Older than the United States. You break them, something comes to balance the accounts. Rob stared at the backpack, at the weeping wound in the cedar, at the green twilight pressing in on all sides. You're talking about folklore. I'm talking about what my grandmother taught me, and what her grandmother taught her, going back to when these trees were young. There are things in the old growth, Henderson. Protectors, punishers, the Sonoqua we call them. Basket women. They take the ones who take without asking. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Sonoqua. Come back to the station, Jenny said. We'll do this right. We'll bring the elders, perform the proper ceremonies. Maybe we can negotiate for her return. Maybe. I can't just leave. The humming started then. It didn't come from any direction. It came from everywhere at once, a vibration so low it was more sensation than sound. Something felt in the bones before it reached the ears. The frequency made Rob's teeth ache, made his lungs feel compressed as though the air itself was being pushed out of the forest to make room for the sound. The radio squawked. Henderson? Henderson, do you hear that? Jesus Christ, I can hear it from here through the radio. He dropped the radio. Because standing at the edge of the clearing, so still he'd mistaken it for a moss-covered snag, was something that should not exist. The description his mind tried to assemble. Large, female-shaped but wrong. The proportions stretched and exaggerated. 8 feet tall, maybe 9. The skin, if it was skin, was dark, textured like old bark. Long hair hung in thick ropes, woven through with cedar boughs and moss. The face was broad, the lips pursed in a permanent expression somewhere between sorrow and hunger. And on its back, woven from cedar bark and sinew and things Rob couldn't identify, was a massive conical basket. The Sonequa. The basket woman. She didn't move, but Rob could hear her breathing, each exhalation producing that subsonic hum that made reality feel thin and negotiable. He couldn't move. 19 years of training, of emergency protocols, of practiced responses to every wilderness threat from grizzlies to hypothermia, and none of it had prepared him for this. His hand found his radio, fumbled it, raised it toward his mouth. The Sonequa's head tilted, considering him. When she spoke, it wasn't in any language Rob recognized, but somehow he understood the meaning beneath the sounds. "Why are you here, little ranger? This is not your dispute." Rob's mouth worked soundlessly. The rational part of his brain, that veteran voice that had guided him through 2 decades of wilderness emergencies, was screaming that this wasn't real, couldn't be real, was some combination of stress and bad air and shared hallucination with Crawford before she'd what? Vanished? Died? Been taken? "The woman who stole from my tree," the Sonequa continued, each word vibrating through Rob's chest cavity. "She is learning. Teaching is my purpose. Some learn quickly, others take longer." "Where is she?" Rob forced the words out. "Where's Melissa Crawford?" The basket woman gestured with one massive hand toward her back, toward the basket. From inside came a sound, rhythmic, wet, organic. Breathing, maybe, or something like it. "She is learning to ask before taking, learning that all gifts require exchange. She will emerge when the lesson is complete." The Sonequa took a step forward, and the ground seemed to accept her weight without compression, as though she was part of the forest's structure rather than something moving through it. "You, little ranger. You have walked my forest for many seasons. You have taken much. Knowledge, peace, the comfort of green growing things. What have you given in return?" I protect the forest. I'm a ranger. I keep people safe, keep the wilderness." "You protect nothing." The words were flat, absolute. "You walk through my trees and you do not see them. You hear my songs and you do not listen. You claim authority over what you do not understand." She moved closer, and Rob could smell her now. Ancient cedar, river stones, the sweet decay of nurse logs converting death into life. "For 19 years you have been a guest in my home. For 19 years you have not once asked permission, not once shown respect." Rob's back hit a tree. He hadn't realized he'd been backing up. "I didn't know. Ignorance is not innocence." The Sonequa was close enough now that Rob could see details he wished he couldn't. Her skin wasn't bark textured. It was actual bark, grown over something else, fused and living. Her eyes were dark as heartwood, ancient and patient and completely without mercy. "The woman in my basket took one thing without asking. You, little ranger, have taken thousands. Every thoughtless step. Every casual dismissal of what you could not explain. Every time you refused to see what the forest tried to show you." "What do you want?" Rob whispered. The Sonequa's lips curved, the expression nowhere near a smile. "What all teachers want. For the lesson to be learned." She reached for him. Rob ran. Training took over, that muscle memory of emergency response. He crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about trail etiquette or leaving traces. The Garmin GPS slapped against his chest. The radio blared Jenny's voice. "Henderson, respond. Rob, get out of there. The elders are saying..." He didn't stop to listen. The humming followed him, that subsonic vibration that made his bones feel loose in his skin. Branches whipped his face. His boot caught on a root and he went down hard, tasting moss and blood. Behind him, something moved through the forest with the sound of wind through branches, though the air was perfectly still. Rob scrambled up and kept running, no longer sure which direction was out, which direction was deeper. The GPS was useless. The screen showed his position, but the map had gone strange, the topographical lines rearranging themselves in patterns that looked almost like writing. The humming grew louder, closer. He burst into another clearing and stopped, chest heaving. This space was different. deliberate. The moss had been cleared in concentric circles around a central point. Standing stones marked the cardinal directions, and in the center, half buried in the earth, was something that made Rob's gorge rise. A skeleton. Human. Old, the bones dark with age, but arranged carefully, ritualistically, with cedar boughs woven between the ribs and skull. This wasn't a burial. This was a warning, or a previous lesson. The humming stopped. In the sudden silence, Rob heard his own breathing, ragged and too fast. His radio was still squawking, but the words were garbled now, broken by static or distance or something else. He turned slowly, knowing what he'd see. The Sonoqua stood at the clearing's edge, patient as stone. "Do you understand yet, little ranger?" "Please," Rob said, and hated how his voice broke. "I'll leave. I'll never come back. I'll tell everyone to stay away, to respect." Words are wind. The basket woman moved into the clearing, and the standing stones seemed to lean toward her, like iron filings toward a magnet. "Only action teaches. Only consequence educates. You will learn, as all who walk carelessly through my home must learn." She reached for him again, and this time Rob couldn't run. His legs had stopped obeying, locked in place by something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite understanding. Her hand, massive, bark-textured, surprisingly gentle, touched his shoulder. The world inverted. Rob found himself on his knees, though he didn't remember falling. The Sonoqua loomed over him, and she was opening the basket on her back, revealing a darkness that seemed deeper than any physical container should allow. From inside came sounds, whispers, weeping, the rustle of living things compressed into impossible spaces. "You will learn," she said, and lifted him easily, as though he weighed nothing. The basket's opening yawned before him. Inside, he could see Melissa Crawford, curled in a fetal position, her eyes open but unseeing, her lips moving in constant prayer or negotiation or apology. Around her, other shapes shifted. How many people had been taken over the years? How many who'd walked carelessly through the old growth without asking, without seeing? The Sonoqua began to lower him into the basket. And Rob Henderson, veteran ranger, 19 years of service, finally understood what Jenny had been trying to tell him. The forest wasn't background. It wasn't scenery. It wasn't a resource to be managed or a threat to be contained. It was alive, truly alive, in ways that preceded and superseded human categories. And it had guardians, protectors, teachers. He had been walking through their home his entire career without once asking permission. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and meant it with everything he had. "I'm sorry, I didn't see. But I see now. I see you. I see what you are, what you protect. Please, please, I'll do better. I'll teach others. The Sonoqua paused. Her dark eyes studied him, weighing something. Then, with a sound like wind through cedar boughs, she lowered him to the ground instead of into the basket. "Perhaps," she said, "you are not beyond teaching after all." She set him down in the moss, surprisingly gentle, and stepped back. Rob lay there shaking, his radio squawking forgotten beside him. The basket woman regarded him for a long moment, then turned and walked into the forest, taking Melissa Crawford and her other students with her. "Wait!" Rob struggled to his feet. "Melissa, you can't just—" The Sonoqua glanced back, and Rob felt the weight of centuries in that gaze. "She will emerge when her lesson is complete. Perhaps tomorrow. Perhaps next spring. Perhaps never. That depends on how quickly she learns." The basket woman's voice grew fainter, blending with the forest sounds. "And you, little ranger, you have been given a gift, the gift of sight. Do not waste it. Teach others to see. Teach them to ask. Teach them that all taking requires permission." Then she was gone, melting into the green twilight as though she'd never been solid at all. Rob knelt in the moss for a long time, his hands pressed against the earth, feeling it breathe beneath his palms. Jenny's voice crackled through the radio, desperate and afraid. Slowly, carefully, he picked it up. "Jenny," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "I'm coming back and I need to learn. Everything you tried to teach me, everything I was too stubborn to hear, I need to learn it now." The walk back took 3 hours. The forest was different now. Not different in itself, but different in how Rob saw it. Every tree was an individual. Every moss-covered log was a universe. Every sound carried meaning, if he learned to listen. The paths revealed themselves not as trails he'd memorized, but as routes the forest permitted him to take. He emerged at the ranger station as the October sun was setting, painting the western sky colors that had no names in English. Jenny met him at the door, her face unreadable. "You saw her," she said. "Not a question." "Yes. And she let you go." "She gave me a choice. Keep taking without asking or learn to see." Rob looked at his hands, still shaking slightly. "I chose to learn." Jenny studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then you'll come with me tomorrow, to meet the elders, to begin your real education." She paused. "Melissa Crawford?" "Being taught. The Sonoqua said she'd return when the lesson was complete." "Maybe she will. Maybe she won't." Jenny's expression was complicated. Sorrow and acceptance and something else. "That's not up to us. It never was." Rob filed his report that night, knowing even as he typed that he'd never submit the true version. Official record. Ranger Henderson conducted search for missing researcher Melissa Crawford. Subject's camp located. Personal effects recovered. No sign of subject herself. Recommend expanded SAR deployment with tribal consultation. Clean. Bureaucratic. Safe. The real report, the one he wrote in a paper notebook with permanent ink, was different. That one he'd share with the people who needed to know. The ones who understood that forests weren't empty spaces between towns, but sovereign territories with their own laws and enforcers. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Sonoqua's ancient gaze, felt the breath of the basket's darkness against his skin. But more than that, he saw Melissa Crawford's unseeing eyes, her lips moving in endless negotiation with forces that predated human language. A week later, hikers found her backpack hanging from a tree 3 miles from where Rob had discovered it. Then her tent, neatly folded, appeared overnight in the ranger station parking lot. Her research notebooks followed one at a time, showing up in impossible places, on the roof of the visitor center, floating in the Solduke River, balanced on top of a trailhead signpost. But Melissa herself never emerged. The official investigation concluded, missing, presumed dead in wilderness accident. Her parents held a memorial service in Seattle. The University of Washington archived her research. Life moved on, the way it does. Rob Henderson continued his patrols, but differently now. He walked slower, paying attention to what the forest was saying. He learned the names of individual trees, asked permission before entering sensitive areas, left offerings the way Jenny taught him. Tobacco, cedar, words of respect spoken aloud. He brought groups of tribal elders into the old growth, documented the traditional protocols, advocated for expanded cultural protections. Some of his colleagues thought he'd gone native, gotten too close to the mythology. A few whispered about stress-induced delusions. Rob didn't argue. He'd learned that some truths couldn't be explained, only experienced. On clear nights, when the moon was dark and the forest breathed its deepest, he sometimes heard the humming, that subsonic vibration that made reality feel negotiable. And occasionally, at the very edge of his vision, he'd see something moving between the ancient trees. Tall, dark, patient as stone. The Sonoqua was still there. Still teaching, still protecting her territory from those who took without asking. And Rob Henderson, veteran ranger, finally understood that his job wasn't to protect the forest from people. It was to protect people from their own ignorance of what lived in the deep places. Some nights, when the autumn wind moved through the hemlock branches in patterns that sounded almost like speech, he thought he heard Melissa Crawford's voice mixed in with the Sonoqua's breathing. Still learning, still negotiating, still paying the price for taking what wasn't freely given. He hoped she'd learned the lesson quickly. He hoped she'd emerge soon. But he knew, with the certainty of someone who'd looked into the basket's darkness, that hope wasn't the same as expectation. The forest kept its own time. The Sonoqua was patient, and some debts took longer than a human lifetime to repay. On the first anniversary of Melissa's disappearance, Rob returned to the witness tree. Something, had healed the bark wound with a patch of woven cedar, beautiful and intricate. Hanging from the branch where he'd found her backpack was a small bundle, wrapped in moss and tied with roots. He approached carefully, respectfully, speaking aloud. "I ask permission to see what you've left here. I come with respect." The forest's breathing paused, then resumed. Permission granted. Inside the bundle was Melissa Crawford's doctoral thesis, printed and bound. Water-damaged but readable. The title, Mycorrhizal Communication Networks in Old-Growth Temperate Rainforests, a Study in Reciprocal Exchange. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Rob sat with his back against the witness tree until sunset, reading her research, understanding too late what she'd been trying to prove. That the forest was a network of constant communication, constant exchange, constant reciprocity. Take without giving, and the network noticed. The network responded. As darkness fell, he carefully rewrapped the thesis and placed it at the tree's base, along with tobacco and a quietly spoken prayer. Then he walked back through the twilight forest, seeing it as he should have seen it 20 years ago. Not as scenery or resources or jurisdiction, but as home to beings far older and wiser than himself. The Sonoqua watched him go, silent as stone, patient as trees. She had taught her lesson well. Whether Melissa Crawford would emerge to benefit from her own education remained to be seen. But Rob Henderson carried the teaching with him, passing it to anyone who would listen. Ask before taking. See what you look at. Respect what you don't understand. Because the old growth remembers, and it keeps accounts. And somewhere in the deep forest, in a basket woven from cedar and consequence, students learn the hard way that all gifts require exchange. All taking demands permission. And ignorance is not the same as innocence. The forest protects itself. It always has. Rob Henderson had finally learned to see. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Melissa.